361. Is Avalon real? Fate has chosen you, and you must face it. Dumbledore's pale blue eyes looked directly at Scott. His voice was gentle and encouraging. Bravery, he said, though people usually associate it with Gryffindor, lives in everyone's heart. Scott felt his racing pulse slow. What had happened had happened. He could not avoid it now. The only way forward was to face it. The important thing, he told himself, is not to let it bend your heart or force you into choices you don't want. Dumbledore continued, what shapes our lives is not our talents, but our choices. Scott managed to smile. You're right, Professor. I won't shrink away because of a vague prophecy, and I won't let it dictate my path. Hearing that, Dumbledore nodded, looking relieved and cheerful in that familiar way. Remember, you are not alone, he added. You have family, friends, and us old professors. I'm sure everyone will help when they can. McGonagall, standing nearby, put a hand on Scott's shoulder. I told you, Mr. Trollope, whatever you face, come to your professors. Flitwick stepped forward, looking up at Scott with a grin. Oh, Scott, I believe in you. You're one of the finest students Ravenclaw has had. You can overcome this. Don't forget, Ravenclaw stands behind you. He patted Scott's arm with more force than his size suggested. Thank you, professors, Scott said, lowering his eyelids in a brief, grateful bow. The fear and panic that had surfaced after the prophecy were gone now, not by force, but simply because he had decided to meet it head-on. Dumbledore spoke again. You can try to find clues and unpack the true meaning of the prophecy. We will help you, though don't force it. Flitwick and McGonagall nodded in agreement. In the days ahead, Dumbledore went on, you'll see everything mentioned in that prophecy, either by accident or suddenly. What you must do is make yourself strong enough to face it. Yes, Scott said. He accepted their help, but he knew he couldn't rely on it alone. No one could protect him forever. He had to become strong himself. Dumbledore's long silver beard trembled as he smiled. If this were any other student, I'd insist on strict protection. But you, Scott, are called a genius. I trust you. Scott nodded, not claiming to be a rare prodigy, but holding enough pride and confidence to believe he could rise to the challenge. Go, Flitwick said. Forget this for now and get some rest. And remember, come to my office after dinner tomorrow. Scott's weekly Tuesday tutoring with Flitwick would continue. From the look on the little professor's face, it might even intensify. Scott accepted without hesitation. McGonagall added, Your transfiguration needs to pick up, Mr. Trollope. You have talent. Use it. I think you might manage animagus work before the summer. Scott agreed. He had always tried to do what he could. Dumbledore smiled. Scott bid the three professors farewell, tucked his magic mirror away, and left the classroom. The three remained, likely to talk further. Scott glanced back at the Transfiguration Club door and hurried off, threading the castle's winding corridors and moving staircases toward the 8th floor, to Rowena Ravenclaw's portrait. For Scott, Ravenclaw, his house, was another kind of support. The portrait of the founder, renowned for her wisdom, might shed light on the prophecy. The portrait's inner door opened for him at his earnest request. He explained briefly, then used the magic mirror to show Rowena the clip of Sybil Trelawney's prophecy. Rowena watched the video in silence. When it ended, she frowned, a rare expression. Helena, seated beside her in the portrait, looked uneasy and clutching at Rowena's sleeve. The performance had visibly disturbed her. Rowena turned her kind but searching gaze to Scott. Are you certain you are the non-existent one in the prophecy? She asked. Scott nodded. The great one? She repeated. If I'm not mistaken, that should be Salazar. Scott looked at her, puzzled. Rowena smiled faintly. When people speak of the four founders as the Great Four, the only great one connected with Medea is Salazar. That could make sense, Scott said, though he still had questions. But what about Merlin? He's called a great one sometimes. Merlin would not be the one to seize the Eternal King's legacy, Rowena replied. Scott tilted his head. The Eternal King, does that mean King Arthur? Prophecies have their own language, Rowena said. In Britain, what other figure would the title Eternal King refer to, if not Arthur? Scott felt the world tilting toward myth. The Eternal King's legacy. Legend says that a dying King Arthur was carried to Avalon by mysterious maidens. Is Avalon real? Rowena shook her head. She didn't know. Merlin and Arthur are historical figures in our traditions, she said. Avalon, however, is a sacred place of Celtic myth and central to ancient Druid belief. You might learn more from the Druids who remain." Scott frowned. As an ancient British legend, Avalon's reality was impossible to judge. The prophecy now tied Salazar Slytherin to legendary figures like Arthur, and the threads only grew more tangled. He thought of Savannah, now a Druid priestess, whose knowledge of Druidic inheritance had already proved complex during their Christmas trip to the Oak Sea. Savannah might know something. "And the Thousand-Mile Eyes? The Scroll of History?" Scott asked. "Forgive me," Rowena said. "I have not heard of those." Helena leaned in, whispering, "It all sounds too complicated. There must be a great secret hidden here." Rowena did not answer Helena directly. Instead, she sighed. "It seems Salazar kept in contact with Medea after he left Hogwarts. Perhaps he directed much of what Medea did, perhaps even the vow she made to me long ago." Helena stared at her mother in surprise. "You mean it was because of him? But how could Medea deceive you?" Rowena's hand went to Helena's. "Sometimes I was only a mother," she said gently. Helena hung her head, shame in her voice. "I can't say I was innocent," she whispered. "It was I who stole the diadem and brought Mother to her sickness." Rowena stroked Helena's hair with a softness that belied the old portrait's painted face. Then she looked back at Scott. "Do you know what to do, Scott?" Scott met her eyes. "For now, I'll be ready mentally and make myself stronger. That's the best I can do." Rowena nodded. "That is all anyone can ask," she said. "Remember, a prophecy shows one possible fate. Do not let it become your chain. If you are strong and wise enough, you can break it." Scott felt steadier than he had when this all began. Standing in the quiet of the Founder's study, the path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time the future felt like something he could meet rather than be crushed by. After leaving the Room of Requirement, Scott went back up to Ravenclaw Tower. He found Luna in the library, tucked into a corner and writing a thesis. "Good evening, Scott," she said without looking up. Luna glanced at him with her pale, dreamy eyes. "You don't look well. Your brain's been invaded by Sorrow Meng," she observed. She set her quill back into the inkwell, reached up and slid the wand from behind her left ear, then twirled it between her fingers like a pen. "Let me think." Her eyebrows lifted faintly. "Maybe I can help you get them out." Scott didn't care what odd idea she had. He pulled a chair up opposite her. "Luna, can you write a letter to Savannah for me?" "Of course," Luna said, surprised. "You can send it by owl." She played with the wand a few more seconds, then pointed it at Scott and brightened. "Want to try?" Scott shook his head. "Forget the Sorrow Meng for now. Can you actually write the letter?" Because of Savannah's brother, Aaron, Scott wasn't sure how the rest of the family felt about him. It seemed safer to have Luna handle it. Luna set the wand aside reluctantly. "I plan to use a brain-fogging charm on you," she admitted. "The Sorrow Meng wouldn't survive in a fogged mind and would flee. Then you'd use finite incantatum to undo it, and your brain would be clean." Her large eyes lingered on Scott's forehead, as if intent on seeing the intruders. Scott almost surrendered, but she turned to the letter instead. "I can write to Savannah," she said, "though I don't know why you wouldn't write it yourself." "Professor Trelawney made a new prophecy," Scott said. He pulled the enchanted mirror from his bag, set it on the table, and cast a small charm to dampen sound. He handed the mirror to Luna and opened the recording. "The scroll of history opens," the mirror intoned, and Scott covered his ears. "The revived witch? The sleeping great one. He desires to devour, defeated by the one who does not exist." When the recording ended, Luna had also covered her ears. Her silver-gray gaze was unfocused for a moment. "Last time Professor Trelawney read for the Thestral herd, it wasn't nearly this terrifying," she murmured, then fixed her attention on Scott again. "Are you troubled by this prophecy?" she asked softly. "It might let those Sorrow Meng creep into your mind." "Oh." A strange expression passed over her face, and for a long beat, smoke seemed to cloud her eyes. Then she said, as if surprised by the thought, "You are the one who does not exist." Scott's surprise matched hers. "How do you know that?" "I don't know," Luna said, bewildered. The cloud in her eyes dispersed. "I just know." Scott stared into her gaze and felt there was something remarkable in it. "The prophecy mentions the Eternal King, King Arthur," he said. "Can you ask Savannah if Avalon actually exists?" "I've heard the legend," Luna smiled suddenly. "I think Avalon exists, but it's fine to ask Savannah. Then I'll leave it to you." Scott thanked her. "You're welcome." Luna's voice drifted back toward her usual ethereal tone. "The Great One who claims the Eternal King's legacy. Are you going to fight him?" Scott shrugged. "Who knows? Professor Trelawney said so. If you need help, even to fight, come to me," Luna said seriously. Scott nodded, though he didn't mean to drag others into danger. Luna watched him, eyes misting, puzzling over the title. "What does the one who does not exist mean?" "You clearly exist here," she mused, frowning. "Maybe it means you don't exist in a certain book, the Scroll of History." "You know what the Scroll of History is?" Scott asked. The mist cleared from Luna's eyes, and she blinked. "No," she admitted. "I don't know, but the Scroll of History opens. That's the beginning of everything in the prophecy." "You're right," Scott said, "but nobody knows what the Scroll of History really is." "Don't worry. We'll find out eventually." Luna retucked her wand behind her ear, picked up her quill, and went back to her thesis. Scott left the library without telling anyone else about the prophecy. Not his roommates, not anyone. Telling people would only add more people to worry. He found it odd that Luna, of all people, seemed a better vessel for accepting such things than his 3 roommates. She had never shown anger or bitterness at being mocked and isolated. Her calm wasn't forced. She simply met everything with a positive, almost otherworldly outlook. Scott felt he could learn from her. Tuesday passed peacefully. After dinner, Scott went to Professor Flitwick's office at the appointed time. Flitwick wasn't alone. Dumbledore and Professor Binns were there as well, still examining the box Scott had retrieved from the troll specimen. "Scott, you're here," Flitwick said, glancing at the clock. Scott's eyes were already fixed on the box. The surface had been cleared, and under the grime it shimmered unmistakably. The brass it had appeared to be was gone. It was a genuine golden chest. "How is that possible?" Scott murmured. He had studied enough transfiguration and metalwork to tell gold from brass. Dumbledore chuckled. "We removed its disguise," he said. "Its concealment charm was very clever. We only discovered it with difficulty." Flitwick smiled. "Magically, gold and brass aren't worlds apart, but gold carries a kind of nobility that suggests whatever lies inside may be far more valuable than we first guessed." Scott bent closer and read the inscriptions. "What language is this? Has it been translated?" Professor Binns, who had been silent, spoke up. "Ancient goblin script, a version even the goblins stopped using long ago. Modern goblins likely can't read it." "So the box is goblin-made?" Scott asked. "Yes," Binns said. "It's over 1,000 years old." Scott reached out and laid his hand on the chest. He pushed his magical perception into it. This time, when he tried, his eyes widened. The blankness he'd felt 2 days before had vanished. He could probe the chest. Slowly, but he could. Flitwick and the others noticed. "What's wrong, Scott?" Flitwick asked. "My magical perception can reach inside the box now," Scott answered without looking up. The professor sat up straighter. "Is that so?" Dumbledore said. He put his hand on the chest and tried as well, but soon let it fall away. "Perception is, in many ways, an illusionary faculty," he said. "But you are different. You can manipulate perception like a spell. You are the only one of us able to use it at this level." Scott felt his perception encountering barriers, layers of checkpoints within the chest. He pushed on. Inside, the chest seemed to contain more chests, layer on layer, like an endless set of nesting dolls. He relayed what he sensed. "This shouldn't be," Flitwick murmured. "Could it be that it contains nothing but wealth?" Dumbledore shook his head at him. "I don't think so," he said. "Continue. Perhaps you haven't reached the core." Scott concentrated, and his perception began, slowly and steadily, to break through the checkpoints, probing deeper into the heart of the golden chest. 363. Fairy Song. Please subscribe. Scott closed his eyes and funneled all his attention into his magical perception, probing the layers of warding like checkpoints inside the golden chest. The office was utterly still. No one spoke to disturb him. After a long, indeterminate time, his perception ran up against an unusually strong barrier and could go no further. At that moment, a message slipped into his mind. He opened his mouth and spoke the strange, halting words aloud. "Morning mist, Murperson tears. Full moon night, werewolf blood. Blazing noon, goblin song sings the golden chapter." He opened his eyes and looked at the 3 professors waiting nearby. "I just got a message in my head," He tapped his temple. I think that's how you open the box. Professor Binns frowned. We need a goblin's help. Dumbledore and Professor Flitwick both nodded. They seemed to understand, though Scott still looked puzzled. Binns glanced at him and explained in his usual flat tone. Collect Merperson tears on a misty morning, obtain werewolf blood on a full moon night, and at blazing noon, have a goblin sing the words on the box in a goblin song. This is a ritual? Exactly, Flitwick said. Goblin song is a distinct goblin magic, an ancient ritual passed through their lineages. What about the Merperson tears and werewolf blood? Scott pressed. Flitwick shrugged. Misty mornings and full moons are when those essences are most potent. They're clearly necessary to open the box, though we don't yet know exactly how they'll be used. Dumbledore smiled. Goblin song is legendary. Even I have never seen it. I imagine once we have the goblin song, the uses for the tears and blood will become clear. Binns frowned again. Merperson tears and werewolf blood won't be too hard to procure, but the goblin song, persuading the goblins, and at what cost, is another matter. Oh, Flitwick gestured at the golden chest. If the goblins see this box, they'll be desperate for it. Binns nodded. By goblin custom, if they discover a goblin-made object, they will demand its return. Scott understood what Binns meant. Goblins are among the most uncompromising of magical beings. They believe anything made by goblins is theirs. A wizard who pays for an item may hold it only for his lifetime. Wizards, by contrast, believe ownership transfers permanently to the purchaser and their heirs. It's an intractable clash of values. Gringotts being run by goblins, and the apparent day-to-day peace between goblins and wizards belied deep resentment. Many goblins still bore prejudice and hostility toward wizards. History was full of bloody goblin uprisings. Binns went on, recounting the oldest of grievances. In the Middle Ages, Godric Gryffindor commissioned the Goblin King to forge a sword, the Sword of Gryffindor. Because the goblins had forged it, the blade absorbed that which strengthened it. Smitten with the sword, Goblin King Ragnuk tried to reclaim it, accusing Gryffindor of theft. He sent his warriors to retrieve it, but Godric, a master duelist, defeated them and warned Ragnuk never to seize it again, threatening death to him and his followers. Ragnuk never tried, but the tale that Gryffindor had stolen the sword lodged deep in goblin minds and festered for centuries. That legend, Scott realized, made approaching goblins for help fraught with peril. Even if the goblins could not simply take the chest from Hogwarts, negotiating with them would be unpleasant. Dumbledore responded comfortably, "Then we'll find a goblin and pay him." He sounded optimistic, as if dealing with goblins would be little trouble. Binns, however, replied, "Whether you can satisfy their greed is another question. Moreover, modern goblins cannot read the ancient goblin script on the box." "That's all right," Dumbledore said with a smile. "We have Professor Binns. He can instruct any goblin on the proper reading." Binns peered at the chest. "You should know, Albus, the inscriptions are not coherent sentences." He floated lightly around the chest. "This thing is like a complicated, scrambled Rubik's Cube of words. I haven't yet managed to reassemble them into anything sensible." Dumbledore smiled. "We have time. Our priority is to learn why this was concealed at Hogwarts." Scott suddenly remembered he had not told Ravenclaw about the chest. He had meant to mention it when he visited Helena's study that weekend, but the prophecy had occupied his mind and he'd forgotten. Still, Ravenclaw probably didn't know. The Room of Requirement, Ravenclaw's alchemical masterpiece, and the portrait work contained a trace of Ravenclaw's consciousness, but it had remained dormant until the Grey Lady re-entered that study. "Let me do it," Professor Flitwick burst out. His voice was unusually sharp. Dumbledore looked at him quizzically. "I don't mean we must find an actual goblin," Flitwick went on. "There's no need to provoke them. I am part goblin. I can perform a goblin song myself." Scott watched Dumbledore's reaction. The headmaster's expression was uncertain. Flitwick met his look. "No point starting a quarrel with the goblins over this." "Can you really perform a goblin song?" Binns asked bluntly. Flitwick's face registered a flicker of strain. He clenched his fist, then nodded gently. "I can, though it's difficult. I won't claim to be as fluent as a true goblin." "Then you will do it." Binns said immediately, clearly unwilling to rouse the goblins. "Have you decided, Filius?" Dumbledore asked. "Yes." Flitwick bowed his head. I'll take responsibility." "Very well," Dumbledore said with a smile. "Don't worry." Flitwick looked at the golden chest set upon the carpet and allowed a small smile. "Besides, I can use this as an opportunity to learn another language." Binns's translucent face tightened into a stiff, dreadful smile. "Of course, I can teach you if you wish." "Oh, of course, Professor Binns," Flitwick stammered, turning away with a look of mild distress. Scott caught the scene from the angle and realized it wasn't only the students who found Binns's instruction intimidating. Binns drifted toward the office wall. "I will begin organizing the script on the box as soon as possible. Albus, please send the box to my classroom." He passed through the wall and left. Dumbledore carried the chest out at once. "Well then." Flitwick waved his wand, closed the office door, and opened the passage to the charms practice room. "Let's begin tonight's lesson." They walked through. Flitwick shut the passage behind them and arranged the practice dummies against the wall. "From now on, I'm going to put you through rigorous dueling training," he said. "It will be practical combat and encompass many essential skills." Scott nodded, drew his wand, and bowed. "I'm ready." Flitwick gestured encouragingly. "You may use any means to attack me." His face grew serious and intent. "I will retaliate. You will take some damage. That is unavoidable." Scott steadied himself and cast a shield charm. Flitwick watched Scott's setup but waited for him to begin. Scott aimed at a practice dummy leaning against the wall. Some dummies were wooden and would shatter under charms. Others were metal and far tougher. Scott transfigured a metal dummy into a massive gray wolf. Woof! The wolf sprang at Flitwick. Scott assumed it would only distract the professor long enough for him to transfigure more helpers, but the plan failed. Flitwick flicked his wand, and a thick rope shot up with lightning speed, coiling around the wolf, and then, in the next instant, bypassing Scott's shield. Scott had just time to throw up a ring of fire at his feet, but the rope did not pass through the flames to reach him. Instead, it retracted, binding the wolf. Then a red bolt streaked from Flitwick's wand, snaking like lightning and shattering Scott's protective shield. "Confringo!" Scott cried, firing a blasting curse before the professor could act directly. Flitwick finally uttered the incantation and blocked the blast with a stronger shield charm. Scott seized the moment, launching 2 familiar transfiguration spells in quick succession. Woof! 2 more gray wolves materialized and lunged from opposite sides. Calmly, Flitwick twitched his wand. 2 blue lights split apart and struck the wolves, freezing them as if encased in ice. Scott cast another shield charm. "Smokescreen," he tried, hoping his superior perception could find an opening in the haze. He freed his 3 wolves under cover, but Flitwick used a domestic charm, wind sweeping, to clear the smokescreen away. Scott shifted tactics, 2 wolves for offense, 1 as bodyguard. He relaxed marginally, but despite his best efforts, he failed to break through Flitwick's defenses and eventually fell to a precise counter. When the duel ended, Flitwick raised his wand to release Scott from a full-body bind. "Well done, Scott. Better than I expected," he said, warm again at once. "Your tactics are clear, your charms skilled, you're already stronger than the average 7th year." Then, with the teacher's duty, he pointed out flaws. "Your main weakness is still lack of combat experience." First update. Although the plan is to update 8,000, 4,000 per chapter. Please vote. Scott nodded when Professor Flitwick admitted he lacked combat experience. Hogwarts had added wizard dueling to the Defense Against the Dark Arts curriculum, but the training there still wasn't enough for what Scott needed. As Flitwick had pointed out, victories over classmates of the same year were crushingly easy and offered no real improvement. He could have sparred with Black or Lupin in dueling class once, but after the revelation about Professor Black's brother's cause of death, Professor Black never returned to Hogwarts and eventually resigned. For a while, the potions professor seemed untroubled by it, but Remus Lupin, who had previously been an assistant, had officially taken over as defense professor. With only one person responsible for the class, Lupin couldn't spare time to be Scott's dueling partner either. For various reasons, Scott's real combat experience hadn't grown much. Most of his prep had been hypothetical tactics. Combat isn't something you master simply by studying. No matter how skilled he was at spells, transfiguration, or charms, he couldn't truly unleash his full potential without in-fight experience. Against a weaker wizard, he could overwhelm them with raw power, but against someone of comparable ability, or only slightly weaker, his lack of experience would likely be a serious disadvantage. Flitwick's offer to help solved a pressing problem. Again, Professor Flitwick told him without giving him a rest. True combat experience only comes from fighting itself. Yes, Scott twisted his sore hand. His wrist had begun to ache from constant wand work, and nodded. This time he lost even faster. It wasn't just fatigue. Flitwick had stepped up the tempo. Though he couldn't cast sweeping spells like Dumbledore, his charms were much stronger than Scott's, and his technique and experience far outmatched a student's. Even with basic spells, Flitwick could suppress Scott through sheer timing and skill. He always reacted at the right moment. The precision of his casting, the smoothness of his transitions, and the agility of his footwork made the duel look like water flowing over clouds. As a renowned dueling champion, when Flitwick was serious, he was terrifyingly formidable. Flitwick finally let Scott rest for a while, and patient as ever, talked him through some practical combat tips during the break. Scott gratefully wrote everything down. They repeated this pattern, duel, rest, instruction, until just before curfew, when the day's training finally ended. He left Flitwick's office exhausted both physically and mentally. Fortunately, Flitwick had only used basic charms, so beyond bruises and scrapes, Scott wasn't hurt. Still, he knew this result showed Flitwick had been holding back. Scott had a long way to go. He wasn't discouraged. He'd never thrived in dueling class with Black or Lupin, and Flitwick was clearly a level above them. In magical ability, Scott wasn't far behind Black and Lupin, and even had advantages they didn't, but the gap lay in accumulated power and combat experience. He made his way back to Ravenclaw Tower with difficulty, and upon entering the common room, collapsed gratefully onto the sofa by the fireplace. It was nearly curfew. Few people remained. Luna was still curled up on another sofa, a thick book in her hands. When she saw him, she rose and crossed to sit opposite. "Good evening, Scott," she said. Savannah replied. She handed him a letter tucked inside her book. "That quick?" Scott asked, surprised. "I only asked you yesterday evening." Luna nodded. "I mailed it this morning. I got the reply this evening." Scott opened the envelope. His name was written on the front. "This letter was inside the one addressed to me," Luna added, as if she already knew what he was thinking. He thanked her, unfolded the parchment, and read. "Scott, are you well? When I received Luna's letter, I was happy, but when I learned of your situation, I became very worried. Luna told me the content of the prophecy." The handwriting was neat and careful this time, not the hurried scrawl of her earlier notes. Savannah's situation at home must have eased somewhat. "You ask if Avalon truly exists? Avalon is central to Druid belief, a legendary utopia, the island of the blessed. I believe it is real. Avalon's existence may even be deeply connected to my family. In the family stories, the Dohertys were once servants of the fairies, of Morgan Le Fay herself, the legendary leader of the 9 fairies of Avalon and King Arthur's half-sister. When I was very young, my grandfather told me about Avalon. Do you remember the Oak Sea you visited? My grandfather said that was once the swamp that led into Avalon. He told me that after the passage closed, the druids who remained transformed the swamp into the Oak Sea. It sounds unbelievable, I know. I don't doubt Avalon's reality, but my grandfather was never calm when he spoke of it. He seemed to be hiding parts of the truth. Wait for me, Scott. I will find out everything. I am already an official druid priest. They can no longer hide things from me." As for the other parts of the prophecy Professor Trelawney mentioned, I'm sorry, I have no clue about them yet. I can only help this much for now. I will search for more and write again if I find anything. The letter ended there. Scott refolded the parchment and slipped it back into the envelope. Luna, still reading, looked up. "Savannah says Avalon is real," she remarked. "My father told me something similar when I was small." "If it's true," Scott said, holding the letter, "Savannah says the passage to Avalon has been closed." "Since it can be closed, it can be reopened," Luna said optimistically. "We just haven't found how to open it yet." "Maybe." Scott lowered his eyelids and let the names from the prophecy circulate in his mind. Scroll of History, 1,000-Mile Eyes, Eternal King, the non-existent one, but they gave him no new clues. The more he knew, the more confused he felt. His thoughts blurred. Brain fuzz, he muttered. By the time Luna cast a charm, it was too late. His exhausted body didn't react, and he slipped into a daze. Finite incantatum. He blinked awake to find Luna holding a book in one hand and pointing her wand with the other. He had never imagined Luna would take such initiative. "Are you feeling better?" she asked earnestly. Scott didn't know whether to laugh or be exasperated. Luna, convinced of her success, beamed. "Oh, the daze has gone. It seems this really works." She twirled her wand and slipped it behind her ear, clearly pleased to have earned the credit. Eddie padded into the common room then, small school bag slung over his shoulder. "Good evening, Scott. Luna." He sat beside Scott with a grin. "All the magic crystal players you made have sold out, even the extras beyond the orders," he said proudly. "And I've got new orders. You'll need to restock." Luna teased, "At this rate, Eddie, you'll be more merchant than wizard." Eddie shrugged. "Nothing wrong with being a merchant." He turned to Scott. "And there's something else." "What?" Scott asked. "It's about the house promotional videos." Eddie's face grew smug. "Students from the other 3 houses are wondering why only Ravenclaw has one. Of course they want promotional videos for their own houses." Scott raised an eyebrow. "Did they place orders?" Eddie shook his head. "Of course not. Why would they ask people from other houses to make them? A lot of folk at Hogwarts have mail-ordered those panoramic telescopes and want to make videos, but they're hitting technical snags." He grinned. "They want us to edit their footage for them." "You accepted?" Scott asked. "You don't have to," Eddie replied, rubbing his hands together. "Just lend me the magic mirror and I'll do it." Scott had no objection. He hadn't expected a product from a momentary idea to spark house-by-house competition. "Fred and George's magical camera?" he asked. Eddie chuckled. "They're still a long way off." For the next few weeks, Scott threw himself into his studies. He knew his strength mattered, and that worrying wouldn't help, so he deliberately avoided dwelling on the prophecy. By the end of March, Professor Flitwick told him before a dueling session that they were ready to open the golden chest. As the one who had discovered it, Scott was invited to observe the ritual. The agreed day was a Saturday. While most students and teachers were cheering for their Quidditch teams at the pitch, Scott followed 3 professors to the top platform of the astronomy tower. Dumbledore let the golden chest float down beside him. "Let's begin," Professor Binns said to Flitwick. "Don't forget what I taught you." Flitwick nodded and approached the chest. He touched the characters engraved on the lid, circled the chest once, then cleared his throat twice. "Oh," he looked a little nervous. "Wait." He rummaged in his wide sleeve and produced a wooden box. Scott recognized it at once, the box that had held Ravenclaw's diadem in Flitwick's office. Flitwick opened it, solemnly took out the diadem, and placed it on his head. "This way I won't forget how to read those blasted ancient goblin texts," he said cheerfully. Then he began. From the first note, Scott slapped a hand over his ears. Whatever goblin song was supposed to be, magic cast through singing with a name that suggested something beautiful and melodic, Flitwick's performance was the exact opposite. Whether it was the nature of the charm or Flitwick's unfamiliarity with it, his singing made Scott's scalp prickle. It had nothing to do with beauty. It was more like a goblin scream. At the top of the astronomy tower, Professor Flitwick stood under the dim light, the Ravenclaw diadem on his head, chanting in an obscure, incomprehensible tongue. His face was twisted with strain. The sound of the goblin song was harsh to the ear. From the golden chest on the floor came a steady, mechanical click. Scott followed the noise with his eyes. Click, click. As Flitwick chanted on, the words engraved on the golden chest began to glow blue, one by one, in no particular order. Just as Professor Binns had explained, the inscriptions were scrambled, so the lights came up randomly. Scott guessed the chest would only open when every word had lit. Flitwick's chanting grew more tortured. Sweat beaded on his brow. His eyes were wide and feverish. Dumbledore stood nearby with a look of helpless concern. Professor Binns drifted around them, his normally impassive face creased with worry. Several times Binns opened his mouth as if to speak, perhaps to stop Flitwick, but no words came. About 80% of the words were lit, and Flitwick was unsteady on his feet. Worse, his body was changing. Scott's stomach dropped as Flitwick's ears and nose lengthened. His features were shifting toward those of a goblin. No, stop now, Phileas, Binns finally said, breaking his silence. If you continue, the dormant bloodline within you will riot. Flitwick did not stop. He kept going as the feverish flush climbed his cheeks, his boots split, and his fingers sprouted sharp nails. The golden chest's clicking grew louder. It shuddered violently. Stop him, Albus, Binns cried. A bloodline riot will throw his magic into chaos and could endanger his life. Dumbledore drew the Elder Wand with a grave expression, but then Flitwick lifted a trembling hand in a small, urgent gesture. Do not interfere. Even so, he did not cease the goblin song. Dumbledore hesitated, wand poised. Binns hovered anxiously. Scott, ignoring everything else, watched Flitwick with mounting alarm. He could not understand why the professor would risk himself like this. No treasure in a chest could be worth such danger. The chest shook harder. Only a few inscriptions remained dark. Flitwick's chanting quickened. At last, he finished. He slumped forward, utterly spent. With a metallic clang, the Ravenclaw diadem slid from his head and hit the floor. Professor! Scott abandoned the shuddering chest and rushed to catch him. He dropped to one knee and supported Flitwick's back. The professor's robes were sodden with sweat. Flitwick's eyes were shut. For a moment, he still looked more goblin than man. A soft white light surrounded him as Dumbledore murmured a calming charm. Calm down, Scott, Dumbledore said gently. Phileas will be all right. You can sense it, can't you? Scott nodded, though he felt a little numb. He reached out with his magic sense to probe Flitwick's internal magic. Beneath the white glow, the professor's boiling power was already subsiding. The goblin-like features were receding. Scott exhaled, relieved. Click, click, click. The chest answered. Cracks spidered across its faces, 3 horizontal and 3 vertical lines on each side, turning the square box into something like a Rubik's Cube. The segments began to twist and spin of their own accord, rearranging, whirring up and down, left and right. When the movement stilled, the inscriptions were aligned neatly. The cracks sealed, leaving only a circular seam around the middle of the 4 faces. The mechanism clicked again and the upper portion eased open. Inside the golden chest sat a smaller silver chest. Flitwick stirred in Scott's arms. Scott dropped his gaze from the silver box and checked on the professor. Flitwick opened his eyes. His features had returned to normal. Scott? Flitwick asked hoarsely. Did I succeed? Scott nodded fast. It's open. Flitwick wiped his face, gave Dumbledore a grateful nod, and struggled to his feet. He retrieved the diadem and walked to the golden chest. With a flick of his wand, the silver chest rose out and landed on the floor. Professor Binns peered over, already examining the new box. You were reckless, Phileas, Binns said without warmth. If I didn't know you, I'd have thought you a Gryffindor. Flitwick forced a short laugh. I almost got sorted into Gryffindor when I first came here, he admitted. Binns studied the silver chest. This box opens with werewolf blood. Scott stepped closer. The silver box was beautifully wrought, with elaborate patterns and a finely carved werewolf's head set like a lock. Dumbledore produced a tiny glass vial, uncorked it, crouched, and brought the vial to the carved head's open mouth. Click, click. The werewolf opened its jaws. Dumbledore poured a few drops of blood in. The carved creature howled. Its gemstone eyes flashed blood red. The silver chest unlapped itself to reveal a smaller black crystal chest within. Dumbledore took that out, then produced another tiny vial. He dabbed a clear liquid onto the sealed eyes of a merperson head set into the black crystal chest. The merperson unclosed its eyes and sang a few ethereal notes. Click, click, click. The black crystal chest opened to disclose a small wooden box, plain, rectangular, like a wand box. It looked rough-grown compared to the ornate outer layers, raw wood, no locks, no decoration. Dumbledore did not touch it. With a gentle sweep of his wand, it eased open. Inside lay a scroll of animal hide. Open it quickly, Binns urged. Dumbledore unrolled the hide. Scott leaned in to read the script carved into it. It was written in ancient runes, every character etched as if cut with a knife. As an old script, many of the runes were unfamiliar to him. He could only grasp parts of it. The text described a secret location and spoke of something built there. It's Merlin, Binns cried suddenly. Dumbledore nodded and turned a smiling, expectant look to Scott. I wonder if that feels like a coincidence, he said. This hide mentions the 1,000-mile eyes. Scott frowned. I'm sorry, Professor. I don't understand. That's all right, Dumbledore told him. You need time. Mastering ancient runes is a long process. Flitwick added kindly, with experience and exposure to more ancient texts, you'll learn to infer meanings from context, even when some characters are unfamiliar. Scott nodded. Go on, Dumbledore said, amused. You must be eager to know. He tapped the hide. It records that the legendary wizard Merlin built a massive ritual called the 1,000-Mile Eyes on the island known as Avalon, and its purpose was to see the future. To see the future? Scott's eyes went wide. The notion felt almost absurd. Dumbledore nodded solemnly. That's what the hide says. Merlin could foresee the future countless times because of it. If that's true, Flitwick breathed, his voice thin with awe. Merlin's magic was beyond all imagination. Indeed, Dumbledore agreed. But who recorded this? And who hid the chest in the Room of Requirement? Binns said, I checked some of the ancient records kept at Hogwarts. That troll specimen has been here a long time, used once as a teaching aid. He met the others' surprised looks. You must remember the history. Relations between wizards and magical creatures were much more hostile in the past. I suspect the specimen was put in the Room of Requirement during some later clearing out. Flitwick asked what Scott had been thinking. Do you know who made the troll specimen originally? Binns shook his head. I found no record. Perhaps you should ask the Grey Lady and the Bloody Baron. They're the oldest ghosts in the school. All right, Dumbledore stood. The Grey Lady, Mr. Barrow. A summons of the headmaster's office felt like a spell of its own. The two ghosts appeared instantly, an advantage Scott knew that the headmaster enjoyed. He remembered last year when Dumbledore had summoned the house ghosts in an attempt to control Medea. The plan had failed, but the memory was vivid. Is something the matter? The Bloody Baron asked in his chilly voice. Scott, why are you here too? Helena, the Grey Lady, looked surprised to see them. The Baron fell silent and drifted to one side. Helena floated level with Scott, peering down. You look a little disheveled, Phileas, she observed, glancing at Flitwick. He hurriedly began to explain, recounting the box and the layered chests. I see, Helena said, then glanced at Scott. Why do you always run into things like this? Scott could only shrug helplessly. The troll specimen, Helena mused, thinking. Let me see, I might remember. It was Henry Gaunt, Medea's son, the Bloody Baron interjected. Helena didn't look at him. She wrinkled her nose in disgust. Who would do such a thing? Make a troll specimen. Trolls are foul. It was him, the Bloody Baron said again, as if confirming some private knowledge. He studied here, and later served as defense against the dark arts professor for a time. The specimen was made during his tenure. He spoke as if he knew details others did not. 366. Merlin's former servant Helena turned, and for the first time looked the Bloody Baron directly in the face. She kept her chin high, arrogant even in the presence of the ghost. What do you know? She asked, cool and sharp. The Baron's translucent form shivered. He sounded a little agitated. I know a lot, Helena. Tell me about the troll specimen, Helena snapped. All right. The Bloody Baron answered quickly. Because of Medea, even after I had died, I still looked after Henry when he enrolled at Hogwarts. Tell me about the troll specimen. Helena's impatience flared. The Baron's ghostly shoulders stooped, as if weighed down by the heavy chains that clanked about him. Henry was ill-tempered, talented and of Slytherin blood, but never popular at school, he said. Even after he became a professor, it was the same. Students didn't like him. The famous Slytherin ghost, normally aloof and taciturn, had abandoned his usual silence. We all know that, Helena cut in. Even I disliked him. Perhaps to salvage his pride, Henry made a troll specimen and brought it to his class, the Baron went on in a low voice. That only made the students dislike him more. Helena interrupted, impatient. We know the real reason he made the specimen was to hide that box. Scott's brow furrowed. What was his purpose? Was it Medea's order? Why hide the box at Hogwarts? The Bloody Baron glanced around, aware of their confusion. The Gaunts are connected to Merlin. Scott blinked. Of all the things he'd heard recently, this was the most outrageous yet. The others looked stunned as well. No one else seemed to have expected that revelation. In the age when Merlin advised Arthur, the Baron continued, the Gaunt's ancestors served in Merlin's court. They learned certain magics from him. Helena's shock turned to a mixture of incredulity and realization. Medea once told me she didn't want to marry into the Gaunt family because of that, the Baron added, his chains clinking as he nodded with difficulty. The movement was slow and strained. Helena's face drained of color. Are you saying Medea married into the Gaunt family because of something connected to Merlin? The Bloody Baron's nod was painful and reluctant. Because the Gaunt's ancestors served Merlin, they knew of his works, perhaps the Thousand-Mile Eyes, among other things. Scott muttered to himself. Even knowing that, it still didn't explain why Medea's son, Henry Gaunt, had gone to such lengths to hide the chest at Hogwarts. The Baron seemed to sense their questions. As far as I know, Medea and Henry were not close. Their mother-son relationship was strained. Henry even poured his troubles out to me while he was a student. Everyone understood the implication. Henry may have hidden the box not because of Medea, but because of the Gaunt family itself. Are you saying Henry hid the box at Hogwarts to keep it away from his own family? Professor Binns asked. That's what I think, the Bloody Baron said. And with that, the Baron's revelations ended. No one present knew the full truth of what had happened between Medea and the Gaunts, but Medea herself. Scott could form theories, but unproven conjectures were just that, conjectures. Since Trelawney's prophecy had been spoken, every clue they gathered felt like another puzzle piece. Only when all the pieces were in place could the picture become clear. After the Charm Club meeting ended that evening, Scott thought for a long time. Finally, he decided to contact Medea directly. For safety, he went to the 8th floor and asked the room of requirement for a lounge. In the opulent room the room provided, Scott sat alone on a large sofa, reached into his deformed lizard skin bag, and pulled out the small fireplace that would let him speak with the revived witch. He poured in flue powder, watched the green flames ignite, and said softly, "Number 01. The flames flared up, sparks hissing. A pleasant voice came from the fire. "Good evening, Scott. I didn't expect you to call me." "I know," Scott replied. Medea chuckled. "You boy, what have you learned?" Scott steered the conversation to the topic he wanted to raise. "You've already gained much influence in the ministry. Are you planning to become the new Minister of Magic, to hold the most power in the magical community?" "It's not as simple as you think," Medea said without hesitation. "I will have to overcome many forces to get there." "Mainly Dumbledore and Lord Voldemort?" Scott asked bluntly. "Lord Voldemort doesn't matter," Medea said lightly. "Dumbledore is the one to contend with. Although in some respects our goals overlap, we both want a better future for wizards." "I'm not sure Professor Dumbledore would agree with that assessment," Scott said. Medea shifted tone. "You did not contact me for political gossip, did you, boy?" Scott frowned and spoke the words he had been holding back. Thousand-Mile Eyes. He didn't reveal the prophecy itself, only the new discovery at Hogwarts. "I found a strange box at Hogwarts and opened it with the professor's help." A small, pleased sound came from the flames. "A goblin treasure chest," Medea said. "So Henry hid it there." "Can Merlin really see the future? Did he foresee this? Can he see us now, back then?" Scott asked. "Who can say?" Medea replied evasively. "Perhaps the great currents of magical history are all visible to him. He stands in the distant past but holds many of the threads of history together." "And you," Scott pressed. "You slipped upstream through history with great care. What is your endgame?" Medea gave a dry, soft laugh. "Perhaps I'm simply afraid of death. Everything I have done, every careful step, was to bring myself back, to live again." Second update. Only 6,000 words today. I'm exhausted, like I've been hit with a brain fog charm. I originally planned to update 4,000 words for the second chapter, but these extra 2,000 trickled out bit by bit. This is an unpleasant feeling. I'll update 8,000 words tomorrow. Good night. Scott did not believe Medea when she said she lived for the sake of living. If it were truly just about survival, why had the ancestor stirred up so much trouble? "You're joking," he said to the tiny fireplace he held. "Didn't you say you were fighting for a better future for wizards? That sounds like something bigger than mere survival." Green flames danced inside the little hearth. Laughter drifted up out of the fire. Medea seemed entertained. She laughed for a long moment before settling. "You don't believe I have such a dream, do you, boy?" she asked, amusement still in her voice. Scott didn't answer. His silence said enough. Medea's tone turned serious. "But I am serious," she said. "I truly want to change the magical world. I want wizards to have a better future." "That's an admirable ambition," Scott said dryly. "Seems odd that you think rhetoric like that would convince me." Medea chuckled. "You doubt me, my motives, my secrets. You think I'm hiding some grander conspiracy." Scott replied quietly, "Your dream might be good, but your methods are strange." It was a careful way to say more. Medea's means were not so different from the terrorism of a certain dark man. Medea sounded almost disappointed. "If I'm not mistaken, Scott, you and I are similar, both willing to do whatever it takes to reach our goals." "Perhaps," Scott said, not denying it. She pressed him. "Then what will you accuse me of?" He frowned. "I won't paper over things with slogans about saving the world, nor will I use rhetoric to deceive and recruit others." "No, you won't. You don't care about great deeds. You only see yourself," Medea said. "And there's nothing wrong with that, is there?" Scott shrugged. "Not necessarily." Medea smiled faintly. "But what if one day you need help, many helpers, to finish a goal you must complete? What will you do then?" Calmly, Scott answered, "I don't think I have such a grand goal. I don't want to be anyone's savior, nor a tyrant king. I just want to manage my own life." Medea burst out laughing. "You are naive, Scott. Many things happen whether you want them to or not." "Maybe you're right," Scott said. Prophecies were one of those things, sudden, inexorable. He could not handle them alone, but he was not without allies. "I have mentors. The professors at Hogwarts have been generous to me. I have a few friends, each dependable. If I need help, I can ask. I won't have to trick people into joining me." The green flame inside the little fireplace suddenly swelled. The heat, though not enough to hurt him, forced Scott to fling the hearth away. It hovered in the air as the flames rose and took form, a human silhouette, ethereal and wavering. It was Medea, only an upper body of burning light hanging over him. "Then pray to Merlin, Scott," she said. "Pray that you never break your word." "I don't intend to," he replied. "Forming a faction like you? It would be exhausting. I wouldn't waste myself on that." Medea regarded him. She seemed to accept that she could not persuade him this way, and moved on. "You are special, Scott." Her hair, a cascade of green fire, swayed. "I have offered you kindness before, gifts, access to secrets in that chamber of secrets. I thought you might yield. I didn't expect you would remain so guarded." Scott stood and looked up at her without fear. "Who made you behave so coldly from the start?" he asked. "Trading away students' talents with a vow, trying to manipulate people like Yaxley and Caro into killing me to break that vow, turning 2 wizards into your drinks right before my eyes. Who taught you that was acceptable?" Medea drifted closer, her burning eyes fixed on him. Scott felt the heat so near he could have touched it, but he didn't flinch. "Do you care?" she asked. "Do you care about the talents those students traded away? About the lives of those 2 wizards?" Before Scott could answer, she spoke as if he had no doubt. "You don't. All you care about is yourself when your life is threatened." He had no answer, because she was right. He had tried to help Milton recover his stolen gift, but when it wasn't possible and Milton adapted, Scott let it go. Medea smiled in a way that was almost tender. "No," she said. "I don't want you dead. On the contrary, I need you to live." Scott blinked. "You want me to live?" "If you cooperate, my plans will succeed faster. But even if not, you living is useful." Medea raised a hand of flame as if to stroke him through the air. "I've given you gifts, particularly the special key you carry, to make sure you can survive." The words set off a cascade of thoughts in Scott's mind. Fragments aligned. 1,000-mile eyes, the great one, the scroll of history, the non-existent one. Living is a good thing. The clues swirled until in a single instant he understood. I am the non-existent one, the figure who does not appear in the scroll of history. The scroll of history records what the 1,000-mile eyes saw. If I exist, the history the 1,000-mile eyes recorded will be altered. Medea wants me to live because my existence can change that recorded fate. Her campaign for a better future, her rallying of wizards with benevolent slogans, all of it is a plan to alter the predetermined history in the scroll of history. That is why she gathers followers. Only hopeful, well-meaning aims attract enough wizards to effect widespread change. For Scott, that revelation explained everything about her behavior. She had not been purely malevolent or purely kind. She had a purpose rooted in manipulating fate itself. But the realization came with a chilling addendum. The prophecy spoke of the Great One trying to devour the non-existent one. The Great One was Salazar Slytherin. If Medea succeeded in changing fate to her standard, Scott's existence would eventually mark him for Slytherin's appetite. Medea wanted him alive to bring about changes. Slytherin would consume him when the changes were sufficient. Scott sat with the contradiction. To stop Medea, he would have to deny his own existence. Yet because he already existed and Medea had acted, the magical world had veered far from whatever the original history had been. The plot had derailed. It could not be put back on the same track. Even leaving Britain would not undo the effects he had already caused. Medea's flame figure cut through his thought. "Don't think so much, Scott," she said, cheerful again. "You only need to live and be ever more prominent." The fiery image shrank, collapsing back into the small fireplace until it was only a finger-sized flicker. "Strive to become an even greater wizard, talented one," her distant voice called. The last spark winked out, and the tiny hearth fell to the thick carpet. Scott leaned back against the sofa and closed his eyes. What could he do? The answer was harsh and simple. Increase his strength and defeat his enemies, whoever they might be. That was all he could choose now. He sat alone for a long time until his mind quieted. Then he picked up the small fireplace and left the common room. He paced the corridor 3 times and finally slipped into Helena's study. "Oh, Scott!" Helena's voice came from a portrait by the bookshelf. The girl in the painting scurried across the frames to meet him, worry in her tone. "Why are you out so late? Has something happened?" Scott nodded. "I spoke with Medea," he said. "I learned something important about the prophecy." "You should speak to Mother about this, shouldn't you?" Helena said, already moving through several canvases to open the inner door. Scott thanked her and entered. The maiden's painted figure trotted over to the portrait of Ravenclaw and settled beside her in a familiar pose. Scott told Ravenclaw's portrait about the golden chest, about Savannah's reply, and then recounted his entire conversation with Medea. He kept his conjectures to himself and simply described what had happened. He trusted Ravenclaw's wisdom, even in painted form. Helena and the older woman in the portrait reacted differently. Helena's face showed shock and confusion. Ravenclaw listened with a calm, knowing smile, as if the pieces were already falling into place for her. "So that's it," she murmured. "The 1,000-Mile Eyes, Merlin's masterpiece." Ravenclaw lingered on the idea of Merlin's grand magic, the 1,000-Mile Eyes. "A research fanatic," Helena mouthed silently to Scott, and he said nothing. When Ravenclaw came back to herself, Scott asked, "Mentor, what could changing the predetermined fate possibly do for Medea and her father?" Ravenclaw frowned faintly and shook her head. "I'm sorry, child. We don't know enough to judge. I never knew Salazar had been to Avalon, nor have I seen the 1,000-Mile Eyes Merlin left behind." Helena, cuddled against Ravenclaw, suggested, "Could it be Medea married into the Gaunt family because Salazar wanted a way to reach Avalon through them?" Ravenclaw answered softly. Whether or not Salazar wanted entrance to Avalon, he did obtain something, or information, connected to Merlin from the Gaunts. Helena's face fell. "Medea didn't want it. I should have helped her back then." Ravenclaw only shook her head. There was no use lamenting the past. Scott, however, remembered Medea's words. She loved her father, yet resented him even more. That memory gave his new knowledge an edge. Helena turned to Ravenclaw, worry plain on her painted features. "Mother, what should Scott do now? What do you think he should do?" Rowena Ravenclaw's painted head turned to Helena as if testing her. "He should." Helena's eyes flicked around. Panic made ideas desert her. Under Rowena's calm gaze, she managed, perhaps he should keep speaking with Medea. Medea never wanted to marry Gaunt. This shouldn't have been her idea at all. Her voice trailed off. Scott watched quietly. Helena in her youth had indeed seemed pure and naive. Rowena smiled faintly, patted Helena's hand, then looked over at Scott standing before the portrait. "And you, my apprentice," she asked, "what do you plan to do?" "I don't have any other choice, honored mentor," Scott said with a hint of helplessness. Relief softened Rowena's painted features. "It seems you have the courage to face it, even if your ultimate opponent will most likely be Salazar." "You know this is a choice without a choice," Scott replied. "If there were other options, I'd take the easier one. Rowena praised him again. Not having options yet, not losing your composure. That is courage. Scott shrugged. I'm just clear-headed. If the only forward is to go all out, there's no point in wasting energy on unnecessary emotions. You two Ravenclaws needn't be lectured on courage, Rowena said kindly. Don't worry, child. You still have time to grow. Didn't Medea ask you to help after you graduate? Helena brightened. That means the changes Medea wants won't be complete until after Scott graduates. Scott smiled at the obvious conclusion. True, mentor, but you don't have time for slow, steady learning. Rowena's tone turned more serious. I won't let you set your pace by the old method of answering questions only when you ask. From now on, I will change my teaching, less passive replying, more active instruction during your study. Thank you, mentor, Scott said, bowing to the portrait. Rowena's painted face looked a little rueful. It isn't my preferred method, she admitted. I will be instilling knowledge rather than letting you discover everything yourself. That will rob you of some independent thinking, which is not ideal. I understand, Scott said. I'll make an effort to think through what you teach me. Rowena looked slightly helpless. Helena, putting on an expression of sympathetic distress, asked, Mother, if this continues, can Scott defeat Professor Slytherin? How could he? Rowena replied. Salazar's combat skill is second only to Godric. He is stronger than Helga and me. Growth is not overnight. Each of the four of us reached our true peak in our mid-30s. You're still too young. So what can we do? Helena asked, flummoxed. First, strengthen the child's ability to look after himself as much as possible, Rowena said. Helena suggested, what if Scott disguises himself and flees abroad after graduation, hide as far away as the East? Pointless, Rowena said. Scott felt a small stir at the mention of the East, but it faded. As Rowena explained, the East offered no guardians now. It would be safer to remain in Britain, where at least Headmaster Dumbledore stood as a strong backer. Then, can Dumbledore defeat Professor Slytherin now? Helena asked. Rowena smiled. I don't know. I can say that when I was alive, Dumbledore was a wizard of our caliber. That confirmed Scott's inclination to lean on Dumbledore. A supporter like him couldn't be dismissed, though Scott knew he could not live permanently in another's shadow. Ultimately, he would have to rely on himself. When Scott left the room of requirement, it was past curfew and the castle lights were out. Walking down the corridor, he saw a door ahead on his left open, spilling warm light across the flagstones. He paused to slip away quietly, but a shadow appeared in the doorway. Dumbledore, in star-patterned pajamas and a nightcap, stood there and waved. Scott approached, bowed, and said, Good evening, Professor Dumbledore. Good evening, Scott. Dumbledore stepped back inside. Come in and have a chat with this old man. Scott followed. The headmaster's office looked the same as ever, though Scott wondered, half amused, how many doors the office really had. Dumbledore motioned to the sofa by the window where he sat, his phoenix dozing on its perch. The portraits that lined the walls seemed to be fast asleep too. Dumbledore didn't ask Scott what he wanted. He poured him a cup of hot cocoa and handed it over. You sought advice from Rowena Ravenclaw's portrait? He asked. Yes, Scott sipped. She says she'll change her teaching from answering questions passively to instilling knowledge more actively. Dumbledore chuckled. He hadn't seemed surprised to hear Scott call Rowena mentor. Clearly the headmaster and the portrait had some communication. Then there is probably no student at Hogwarts more diligent than you right now. No, Scott said with humility. There are those who use time-turners to take extra classes and who earned a dozen OWLs at beginner level. They're more industrious than I am. As headmaster, Dumbledore said with a playful wink, I do not encourage that. He waved away the idea of overdrawing one's youth. Getting 12 certificates is admirable, but a report card gained by stealing time is not something I value highly. Far better to find subjects you love and pursue them deeply. Scott agreed inwardly. He planned to drop several advanced electives in the second half of his 6th year: astronomy, history of magic, herbology, care of magical creatures, so he could focus on transfiguration, charms, potions, ancient runes, arithmancy, and defense against the dark arts. He told Dumbledore his plan. The headmaster nodded approval. Professors set requirements for advanced classes anyway. A smart, organized student needed time of his own. Scott thanked him, wondering why Dumbledore had called him in. He had expected something important. Instead, the headmaster wanted simply to chat. In the conversation that followed, Dumbledore never mentioned the prophecy. After they finished their cocoa, Dumbledore rose and waved him toward the door. "Go back to your dormitory and sleep," he advised. "You cannot grow by burning the candle at both ends." Scott blinked at the unexpected counsel. Dumbledore was telling him not to sacrifice rest in the name of getting stronger. Scott thanked him again, bowed, and left. As he reached the corridor and glanced back, the warm-lit door had vanished. Where it had been was now rough stone wall. Scott smiled and headed for the spiral staircase. Using his magic sense to steer clear of Filch and his cat on patrol, he made it safely back to the dormitory. Wonder what Scott was up to. Someone murmured as Scott pushed open the dormitory door. Eddie's voice came from behind the curtains. "Good evening. You still up?" Scott asked. "We were just talking about you," Eddie called. Scott crossed to his bed, shrugged out of his robes, and hung them up. "Are you in love?" Roger asked. Scott replied, helpless. "Worry about yourself. You should look at your ex." Laughter came from behind Eddie's and Milton's curtains. Roger's ex, Caccini, had changed a lot recently. Though she had slapped Roger once, he had not been angry. Curiosity about her transformation kept him paying attention, and she'd mocked him publicly for his interest, costing him face. Once delicate and piano-obsessed, she'd become a popular Hufflepuff leader, with a following that outshone Cedric. Miss Mill, who had once watched Roger and Caccini with envy, had now fallen into Caccini's orbit. "Oh," Roger groaned, "don't say it. I don't dare provoke her anymore. I hide when I see her." "Poor Roger," Eddie teased. "You finally met a girl you can't handle." "At least I handled her once," Roger protested, trying to save face. Everyone laughed, and the dormitory relaxed into its usual cheer. After Scott showered and came back to bed, they resumed gossip. "Caccini's a reserve member of the Weird Sisters now," Milton said. "She could be the first true female member." "She's getting more androgynous," Eddie added, teasing. "Her hair used to be colorfully short. Now it's so close-cropped you can see her scalp." Roger fell quiet, then muttered from behind his curtains. "There must be a reason. People don't change like that for no reason." "Everyone can see there's a reason," Eddie said. "No one knows what it is." "Don't worry, brother," Eddie promised with mock solemnity. "I, Eddie Carmichael, will dig up that reason. There's no secret at Hogwarts I can't unearth." Scott smiled and drifted off. The light-hearted teasing and the familiar company eased the tension he'd been carrying. He slept more easily than he had when he left the room of requirement. 369. Caccini's late-night invitation. Because he had bragged in the dormitory that he would uncover the reason for Caccini's complete change, Eddie had become obsessed with the secret for a while. Scott didn't know exactly what measures Eddie took, but over the following days he always saw him hanging around with Hufflepuff students. Eddie's efforts, however, led nowhere. He never mentioned any progress. Unexpectedly, Milton, who often attended the classical music club with Caccini, found a clue first. It came up during the usual pre-sleep dormitory chat. Milton sat on his bed, wand in hand, casually drying his long hair with a drying charm, when he said to Scott and the others, "There's something. Maybe I should tell you. Just after dinner today, while I was practicing piano at the club, Caccini quietly asked me if I would be willing to exchange my musical talent back." Scott and the others froze. They all knew that Milton's musical talent had been transferred to Caccini by Medea. But how is that possible? Eddie was the first to speak. Could Caccini already have joined that Green Robes group under the Resurrected Witch? Scott frowned. Caccini's question sounded impossible. Even if Medea agreed to swap talents with Caccini, where else in Britain is there a place like Hogwarts with enough raw magic to sign a binding vow like that? He had learned from the Ravenclaw mentor that the magic vows Medea used for talent exchanges had extremely strict conditions. They should be impossible to reproduce. No one else at Hogwarts could sign such a contract, and outside Hogwarts, Medea couldn't find a suitable site. Roger chimed in from another angle, surprised. So she regrets trading with Miss Slytherin? That showed how deeply Caccini's earlier disregard for musical talent had impressed him. Milton stopped drying his hair and put his wand on the small table beside his bed. She suddenly asked that and then left without waiting for my answer, he said, running fingers through his hair and looking hesitant. The dormitory was quiet for a few seconds. Scott sat up and asked Milton, "What do you think?" "Me," Milton blinked. "I've accepted the situation." "But Caccini's question made you waver, didn't it?" Scott pressed. Milton pursed his lips. "You all said it. What she asked couldn't possibly happen, right? Let's just go ask her directly tomorrow," Eddie said. "Ask why she said something like that." Milton nodded. "Sorry, I'll clear it up," he said. Eddie poked his head out and grinned at Milton. "Why are you apologizing?" Milton smiled sheepishly. "I feel like I've caused you a lot of trouble, especially with this. It was my choice to trade with Miss Slytherin back then." "Don't blame yourself," Scott said. "We haven't been much help either." "That's enough," Milton said, smiling. As Scott lay back down, Roger added, "Scott, Eddie, you two go with Milton to ask Caccini. I won't." "All right," Eddie replied with a grin. "So Big Sister Caccini won't give you a lecture, kid." "Hey!" Roger howled unhappily. The next day at noon, Scott and Eddie accompanied Milton and waited at the entrance to the Great Hall as Caccini approached with a group of girls. Scott noticed that Caccini's appearance had shifted again. While the other girls wore short skirts and long stockings, she wore men's trousers and leather boots. Her hair had been cut into a close crew cut, her ears were dotted with silver hoops, and she wore no makeup. "Good afternoon, Caccini," Milton called. "Milton?" Caccini grinned, flashing two sharp canines. "Do you need something?" The grin was mischievous. Her manner was bold and uninhibited, a total reversal of her former dignified lady image. Scott checked her magic briefly to be sure she was still herself. The last time he'd spoken to Caccini in person, her image had shifted from lady to a flashy girl. Now she'd blurred gender altogether. He'd seen this look from afar before, but this close it was striking. He heard Eddie audibly gasp. Milton, however, seemed used to it. "What you said last night?" Milton began softly. "Oh, that?" Caccini smiled playfully. "What do you think?" "I want to talk to you," Milton said. "Talk? Of course." She said a few words to her companions. The girls giggled and walked into the Great Hall. Caccini looked up at Scott and Eddie and put a hand on Milton's shoulder. "Are these two your bodyguards or your nannies, little Milton, dear?" "No, not." Milton reddened and took 2 steps back. Scott stepped forward. "Hello, Caccini. Eddie and I are just curious about what you said. Is it inconvenient for us to hear?" Caccini's teasing smile softened. Scott, you really are a joker," she sighed. "Who at Hogwarts could refuse you, the Ravenclaw genius?" She spun on her heel and strode off. "Follow me. I know, telling Milton is like telling everyone in your dormitory." Scott patted the stunned Milton, and the three of them trailed after Caccini. She led them away from the Great Hall to a nearby empty classroom. "Come in," she said, swinging her legs over the teacher's desk as she sat, crossing them and beckoning. "Close the door." Scott shut the door, and they approached her. Just as Milton was about to speak, Caccini raised a hand to stop him. She pointed a finger ringed in black at Eddie. "Are you sure you want him to hear what I'm about to tell? I think he'll spread it around Hogwarts as fast as he can." "That's slander," Eddie protested. "That's defamation." Scott smiled at Eddie. "He knows what can and cannot be spread." Caccini lowered her hand and rubbed her chin, amused. "Very well." Scott gave Milton an encouraging look and sat down at a desk. Eddie immediately sat beside him. Milton stood in front of Caccini. He asked, "Caccini, what did you mean by what you asked me yesterday?" "What did I mean?" Caccini smiled. "I meant it literally." Milton hesitated. "But—" "No buts," Caccini said, looking down at him from the desk. "You just need to tell me, Milton Graves. Are you willing to exchange it back?" Milton faltered for a few seconds, then nodded. "Yes, of course, I'm willing." "Very good." Caccini moved close, whispered something in his ear, patted his shoulder, then jumped down from the desk and left the classroom, her silhouette bold and brisk. "What was that? What did she say?" Eddie complained loudly. "She said she had a secret not to be told to others, and she left like that?" "She told me to come to the classical music club at midnight," Milton said, turning around. Eddie grumbled. "She's teasing. What kind of secret can't be said now?" "Are you going tonight?" Scott asked Milton. "Since I decided to clear this up, I'll go," Milton answered. "I'll go with you," Scott said. He didn't like the idea of Milton going alone. "Me too," Eddie quickly agreed. Under Scott's steady look, Milton didn't argue. "Thank you," he said gratefully. During Defense Against the Dark Arts in the afternoon, Scott observed Caccini again. Her change was extreme. The Hufflepuff girls clustered around her, treating her like a leader. She handled petty rivalries and duels with casual ease. Boys watched her with envy. Roger, who'd been single for some time, couldn't hold a candle to her style. "Do you think she's still herself?" he asked Milton quietly. Milton looked surprised, as if he didn't understand the question. Scott hesitated. There seemed to be no magic in their world that could possess a body, but he pressed on. "I mean, is it possible someone else's soul has taken over her body?" "Possess someone? Is there such dark magic?" Milton looked bewildered. "No, I'm sure she's still her. I can tell from the music she plays." "That's good," Scott said, relieved. If body possession were real, Voldemort wouldn't have merely been a parasitic presence on Quirrell's head 2 years ago. That evening, Scott returned to the dormitory exhausted after several run-ins with Professor Flitwick's dueling demonstrations. Roger eyed him sprawled on the bed. "You look more tired than after a Quidditch match. Are you sure you can go with Milton tonight?" Eddie offered. "Let Roger and me go instead." "You should rest," Milton said. "It's just an appointment in Hogwarts. There won't be any danger. At most we'll be caught by Filch and Madame Norris, or a passing professor, and get points docked and detention," Eddie laughed. Scott shook his head, leaned against the stacked pillows, and took a restorative potion from his deerstalker leather bag, pouring it down. "I'll be fine," he said, checking his pocket watch. 2 hours until midnight, enough time to recover. They decided to go as a group. Scott and Eddie would accompany Milton inside. Roger, who didn't want to meet Caccini, would keep watch outside the classical music club room. They left the dormitory around 11:30 and made their way below Ravenclaw Tower. "Are you all right?" Milton kept worrying about Scott. "I'm fine," Scott said. His muscles ached a little, but his magic had recovered and he felt capable enough. "Just follow me." He led the way, pushing his magic perception to its limits. They moved carefully through the castle and made their way to the main building's basement. Everyone was a little on edge, tiptoeing past Snape's office and avoiding making noise. No one wanted the potions master appearing out of the dark. After winding through pitch-black corridors, they reached the entrance to the classical music club's room near an abandoned dungeon. Wind moaned through vents above the dungeon, making strange, hollow noises. Iron chains hanging in the dungeon clanked faintly. In the stillness of the night, the sounds seemed unnaturally loud. "Let's go," Scott said. He pushed at the heavy wooden door. It opened easily under his hand, and warm light spilled onto the stone floor in a long strip. Faint piano music drifted from inside the room. "Come in." Scott pushed the door wide with one hand while he held his wand in the other. The piano music grew clearer. He glanced back at Roger and stepped into the practice room. The classical music club's room was tall and spacious, cluttered with instruments and stacked chairs. The door creaked shut behind him. When he turned, Roger had closed it. Scott gave him a look that plainly asked why he'd come in. Roger's eyes replied that he didn't think anyone needed to stand guard. Scott snorted, ignored the question of whether Roger was really spooked by the corridor outside, and moved toward the music. He and his 4 companions threaded around music stands and piled instruments until they reached the back of the room. There sat a huge black piano, its lacquer gleaming under the light of a dozen candles on a floor candelabrum. Caccini, dressed in a black men's tuxedo, was at the keys, her hands moving smoothly over them. The music flowed like water. Scott barely glanced at Caccini. His attention was fixed on Ms. Grapeland, leaning against the piano. The assistant had one leg crossed over the other, long legs in tight trousers and over-the-knee boots. She held a pipe between her fingers and blew a lazy ring of smoke. When she saw Scott and the others, a warm smile spread across her round face. She waved and then shushed the boys with a finger. Scott nodded. He and his roommates stood still and listened as Caccini finished the piece. Caccini's eyes were half closed, her body swaying gently with the music. When the last notes faded, her hands lifted from the keys, and she held that stillness for a beat before opening her eyes. "How was it?" Her serene expression gave way in an instant to the mischievous look Scott and the others had already seen that day. She rose, closed the piano lid softly, and fixed her gaze on Milton, one of the boys. I wrote this piece myself, she said with a smile. What do you think, Milton? This is the most beautiful new piece I've heard all year, Milton answered sincerely. Yes, it's also my most satisfying work, Caccini replied without a hint of modesty. Its name is Caccini. It's very beautiful, Caccini, Grapeland said, still leaning against the piano, and clapped lightly. Caccini thanked her and turned back to Milton. Is its name Caccini? Milton stepped forward. This piece, it's about the former Caccini. Caccini's cheerful smile stalled for a moment, then smoothed away as if nothing had happened. Yes, the former Caccini. She moved to Grapeland's side and leaned on the piano. I'm glad you noticed, Milton. It really is you. Milton looked at her blankly, as if he didn't quite get what she meant. Caccini stepped closer. I have to thank you, Milton, she said. If it weren't for your extraordinary musical talent, I couldn't have composed this piece. Thank you for the compliment, Milton said. Caccini laughed, then teased. Are you not going to be modest or claim you always had musical talent? Milton stayed silent. All right, I won't push, she said, shaking her head with a smile. We all know how good your original talent was. This isn't something I could have written from scratch. Milton's silence seemed to accept that. Of everyone present, only Ms. Grapeland looked a touch surprised. The others showed nothing. When it came to music, Milton was always serious and honest about his feelings. I really admire your musical gift, Caccini told Milton, moving in front of him. It lets me express myself more freely. Honestly, that feeling is wonderful. Milton nodded. Caccini laughed again and then sighed. But that's all it ever was, she said. For the person I used to be, music was everything. For who I am now, power matters more. She set a hand on Milton's shoulder. He shrugged, tried to pull away, but her hand stayed. He gave in to it rather than struggle. Hey, Milton. Caccini leaned close and whispered, Do you want to switch back? We all regret the deal with Miss Slytherin, don't we? She didn't bother lowering her voice much. Everyone nearby could hear. Besides, I've discovered my talent is better used on myself, she went on. It took me ages to finish a piece, while the former you churned out works that could stand alongside Caccini. She murmured more in Milton's ear, and this time the reaction was visible. He took a quick step back, freeing himself from her hand entirely. Milton disliked people getting close. Even with friends like Scott, the most intimate touch was a friendly pat on the shoulder. Scott had jokingly called him asexual for that. If it can be switched back, Milton said, looking a little stunned. I want to switch. Do you have a way to do that? Caccini blinked and looked toward Grapeland. The other boys followed her gaze. Don't be so grave, Grapeland said with a smile that still managed to be welcoming. She took a few steps over and exhaled a plume of smoke. Isn't magic wonderful? She asked Milton. With a bit of additional magical talent, you could even become a more powerful wizard than you ever were originally. Milton, a little shorter, looked up at her. Whether I become more powerful isn't the point, Miss Grapeland. You really want to switch back, don't you? Grapeland stared into his eyes. Then let's arrange an exchange. Scott stepped forward. Are you sure you can do that, Miss Grapeland? He asked calmly. Oh, Scott? Grapeland turned to him with a smile. What do you think? You've been watching me. Do I look like a dark wizard hiding out at Hogwarts? Scott didn't answer that question directly. He kept his eyes on her, waiting for her answer to his own. Grapeland inhaled from her pipe. Can I do it? Switch the talents of these two young wizards? She said slowly. Of course, I can't do it myself, but someone can. Scott was about to utter Medea's name when Grapeland cut him off quickly. I'm not talking about Miss Slytherin. Scott stared at the assistant professor standing before him. Grapeland returned his suspicious look with a confident smile. He glanced at Caccini. She kept watching Milton intently. It seems you're very confident, Roger said suddenly. Caccini, I hope you're not joking around with Milton. Caccini's smile vanished. She gave Roger a casual, almost disdainful look and scoffed. Don't worry, Davis, she said coldly. I wouldn't drag an innocent Milton into this because of my history with you. You aren't that important. That's for the best, Roger muttered and fell silent. Caccini scoffed again. Scott watched Roger's face flush. Milton shook his head at Scott and the others and addressed the two women directly. Caccini, Miss Grapeland, I've already made my position clear. What do you intend to do? Caccini looked back at Grapeland. Scott and the others grew more convinced that Grapeland had orchestrated today's confrontation. Grapeland didn't answer Milton's question. Instead, her eyes fixed on Scott. She smiled a little. I need to speak with you alone, Scott. Scott's three roommates all looked at him. Of course, Scott thought. The whole thing had been aimed at him, too. Miss Grapeland, Milton said, a little anxious, this is my matter. You shouldn't involve Scott. He reached out and tried to pull Scott behind him, but Scott didn't move. He stood his ground, watching Grapeland to see what she meant. Her expression remained friendly, betraying nothing. Don't worry, I just want to talk to him here, she said to Milton soothingly. We won't leave your sight, you just need to stand a little further back. Milton's tone hardened. This has nothing to do with Scott. If Caccini wants to trade talents with me, she should make that clear to me. He turned to the silent Caccini. And, though I haven't said it, I understand that the magic talent I might trade for musical talent may not necessarily belong to you, Caccini. It's mine, Caccini said, frowning, meeting Milton's gaze. My magic talent is mine. Her tone left no doubt. Grapeland smiled at Milton. Of course we'd verify it before approaching you. Then she looked back at Scott. So what's your answer, Scott? Do you want to talk alone? Yes. Talking alone didn't bother him. He wasn't afraid Grapeland might attack. It wasn't that he believed she wouldn't, but he trusted his own strength and methods. Scott! Milton tried again to dissuade him. It's all right, Scott said, flashing a confident smile at his three roommates. I'll be fine. Let's go, Caccini told the three boys. We'll stand a little further away. She stepped off to the side. Are you sure? Eddie asked Scott one more time. Scott nodded. Eddie and Roger exchanged looks, then pulled Milton away, but they stopped within 10 paces, close enough to intervene. Grapeland offered no objection. You set the charm, she said to Scott. To avoid misunderstandings, I won't take out my wand. Scott nodded and casually set up a soundproofing charm. He didn't wait for Grapeland to speak first. Now we can talk alone, Miss Stephanie Grapeland, he said, using her real name to take the initiative. Grapeland didn't flinch. She tilted her head, a hint of surprise in her smile. All right, I suppose I should introduce myself properly. She held the pipe between her fingers. I am Stephanie Grapeland, a Ravenclaw graduate. Wilhelmina Gropeland is my sister's name. Why come to Hogwarts under Wilhelmina's name? Scott asked. Grapeland answered casually. Dumbledore needed an assistant for care of magical creatures, and Wilhelmina was busy researching hippocampi in Loch Ness, so I went in her stead. Why not use your real name? It's not something that needs hiding, is it? Wilhelmina is more famous than I am, Grapeland said, taking a puff from her pipe. A haze of smoke curled from her full red lips. Many witches and wizards know her work on magical creatures. You're not bad yourself in class, Scott said evenly. Thank you, she replied with a smile. My true identity isn't important. Dumbledore knows I'm not Wilhelmina. It's getting late. Let's discuss the other matter. Please, go ahead, Scott said. Grapeland produced a golden card from her pocket and offered it. I'm inviting you to join our organization. Scott didn't take it. He met her eyes and asked, deliberately, Dumbledore's Order of the Phoenix, Lord Voldemort's Death Eaters, or Medea's Green Robes. None of those. Grapeland kept the card extended. The organization founded by Miss Slytherin is officially called the Whole Wizarding Council. Scott realized the Green Robes had a formal name, but that wasn't his priority. Introduce your organization, Miss Grapeland. I won't accept something I don't understand. Grapeland withdrew the card with a shrug. Right, that makes sense. She pulled out a roll of parchment, unrolled it, and peered at it as if reading from a script. Our organization is called the Scholar Alliance, the oldest continuing magical society in Europe. Its members have always been wizards, renowned in various fields. Scott raised an eyebrow at the earnest, almost perfunctory delivery. An apparently jittery professor recruiting with a handwritten pamphlet didn't inspire confidence. She read on. The purpose of the Scholar Alliance is academic collaboration, research into the mysteries of magic. Most members avoid politics and conflict. We prefer wizards who focus on the craft itself. Stop! Scott held up his hand. Give me the parchment. I'll read it. No problem, Grapeland said eagerly and pressed it into his hand. The handwriting was hers. Messy, cramped, a little disorganized but readable. Scott skimmed it. The Scholar Alliance, according to the sheet, had been founded in the 15th century, over 500 years old. Not as ancient as Hogwarts, but still venerable. It was a loose association of scholarly wizards, originally meant to pool talent to revive ancient magic. Over time, it relaxed its scope, leaving members free to pursue varied research. The description made it sound like a purely academic exchange group, avoiding politics and conflict. Scott still didn't entirely trust the document. No organization was just what it seemed. He put it down and looked at her. Grapeland's sales pitch resumed at once. Joining the Scholar Alliance puts you in contact with peers across Europe, rare geniuses in every field. You'll have access to renowned experts at any time. The Scholar Alliance is perfect for someone like you. Her tone was almost like a salesperson's. Scott almost laughed inwardly. She continued, earnest and persuasive. We help our members with resources, funding, and knowledge. If you encounter a problem, other members will help. You can get whatever you need. Sounds good. Scott smiled. So what do I give in return? Grapeland's face lit up. You don't have to pay money. Scott's distrust didn't ease entirely. Grapeland, almost feverish, went on. The Scholar Alliance exists to preserve wizarding civilization. Join, and you can exchange your original knowledge for academic credits. Then you use those credits to obtain what you want. Participation is voluntary. That made more sense. There's always a cost. Scott's interest piqued. Knowledge exchange. Can knowledge be quantified? How does one trade it for academic credits? Can any knowledge be exchanged? Only original knowledge, Grapeland said. You can't exchange things you learned in school or read in a book. But if you invent a new charm, recover an ancient magic, translate lost runes, craft a new potion, uncover ruins, or document the habits of a previously unknown magical creature, that can be exchanged. Anything not already in the Alliance's stores can be converted into credits based on rarity. Scott's brow rose. Their appetite for knowledge seemed vast. How do you quantify it? How do you ensure fairness? Grapeland produced the golden card again, holding it between two fingers and shaking it with a smile. That's what this does. Scott looked puzzled. She explained, over 100 years ago, the arch-scholars of the Scholar Alliance built a great magical device through massive rituals and alchemy. Our members call it the Knowledge Bank. She placed the golden card back beside her pipe and extended a finger. First, Arch-Scholar is the highest title granted by the Alliance, great wizards who made outstanding contributions to wizarding civilization. She lifted a second finger. Second, the Knowledge Bank is the device that stores all knowledge and processes exchanges. Knowledge for academic credits and credits for resources. It's a magical device, not sentient, so there's no bias. Picking up the card again, she shook it. If you join, I'll activate this identity card for you. It links to the Knowledge Bank anywhere in the world. You can use it to trade knowledge for credits or credits for whatever you need. She held her hand out. So what are you waiting for? Accept this opportunity. Scott still didn't take the card. Grapeland's expression flattened for a moment. I'm really not cut out for this kind of work, she murmured, then changed tack quickly. Her eyes flicked toward Milton. Scott, you want to help your friend, right? With academic credits, you could help that boy get his musical talent back. Is Caccini a member of your organization? Scott asked calmly. By your own description, if she wants her magic talent returned, she should earn academic credits herself. Grapeland's eyes twitched slightly, but she didn't answer immediately. The implication hung in the air. If the Scholar Alliance could convert original knowledge into credit, perhaps there was a way to reclaim lost talents, if one could supply the necessary credits. The conversation was only just beginning, and the quiet tension around them suggested others were listening more closely than they pretended. Caccini isn't a member of the Scholar Alliance. You should know that. She doesn't qualify, Grapeland said. No, I don't know, Scott thought. Who could tell what their standards were? But one of her relatives is. Grapeland added the words quickly. Scott gave her a doubtful look. Then let her relative earn enough credits to make the exchange. He's dead, Grapeland shrugged. Scott wanted to ask what that had to do with him, but she kept talking. Caccini inherited some credits from him, but it isn't enough to get what she wants. She glanced again at Milton. That boy over there doesn't meet the Scholar Alliance's recruitment standards either. Then she turned to Scott and smiled. If it were you, you could trade for some credits. Her voice went soft, persuasive. That way, both of those kids' wishes could be fulfilled. Scott glanced at Milton. The younger boy, 10 feet away, was watching them nervously, clutching his charm. When Scott's eyes met his, Milton shook his head quickly. Scott read the message. Please don't agree to anything because of me. That child is your good friend, isn't he? He's very worried about you, Grapeland continued. Don't you want your friend to get his wish? Scott withdrew his gaze and kept his expression flat. Miss Grapeland, do you think I'm the sort who makes selfless sacrifices? But he is one of your closest friends, she pressed. And Caccini's ex, that tall boy over there, he's also a friend of yours, isn't he? He feels guilty for her. What does that have to do with me? Scott's tone stayed cool. Even if he cared for them, he wouldn't let her read him. Grapeland studied him for a few seconds, as if trying to decide whether to push harder. Scott had activated a clumency as a precaution. He showed no sign of legitimacy, and his face gave nothing away. Grapeland's smile faltered into something like resignation. How about this? If you join the Scholar Alliance, I'll make up the credits Caccini needs. Then those two can regain their talents. Her voice wrenched into an appeal. No hurry. Scott wasn't moved. He reached out and handed the parchment back to Grapeland. I think I need time to consider. She stared for a few seconds, then took the paper and drew a long drag from a peculiarly scented cigarette in her pipe. Smoke curled out slowly. Fine, she said. I can give you time. Scott allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Professor Dumbledore knows your identity, doesn't he? So he must also know about the Scholar Alliance. Of course, Grapeland said. Then, is Dumbledore a member? He's the greatest wizard of our time, maybe even a grand scholar? No. The amiable smile became forced. No, unfortunately, Professor Dumbledore is not one of us. Seeing the disappointed look on Scott's face, she hurried to explain. Although he is great, he's spent so many years on the front lines fighting dark wizards that he's not a pure scholar. What about Professor Flitwick? Professor Vector? Professor Babb? Scott searched for the right name. They're scholars who don't engage in politics. Besides you, which Hogwarts professors are in the Scholar Alliance? Sadly, only I am. Grapeland sounded a little mournful. Scott frowned. You're telling me these professors don't meet the Alliance's standards? Before she could answer, he added, I'll speak with the professors and give you my answer at the next Care of Magical Creatures class. He flicked his wand and dispelled the muffling charm around them. Good night, Miss Grapeland. Then he called to his roommates. Let's go. They hurried to his side and watched Grapeland leave with cautious eyes. She only waved. Good night, boys. Scott stole one last look at Caccini standing on the other side of the room, then led his three friends out of the common room. The corridor was dark and silent. No one spoke as they walked. Eddie exhaled loudly when they reached the castle's ground floor. Finally out, he whispered, patting his chest. Even passing Snape's office made my heart race. Scott, Milton started. Not now. Scott raised a hand. Wait until we're back in the dormitory. Milton nodded. Scott guided them through the castle, avoiding Madame Norris prowling the corridors and Peeves who never slept. They reached the Ravenclaw Tower dormitory without trouble. As soon as they were inside, Eddie burst out. Scott, tell us, what did she say? Scott took off his robe and hung it up, sat on his bed, kicked off his shoes and socks, then started working through the conversation in his head. When he was done, the room fell quiet for a beat before Eddie spoke again. Do you think any of it's true? He asked. Does some vast, ancient society like that really exist? Roger was skeptical. Sounds like nonsense to me. Milton? Milton shook his head. I've never heard of it either, but Miss Grapeland did tell Scott that Dumbledore knew about the group. Even if it's real, Roger said, if Dumbledore and Flitwick haven't joined, that says something. Maybe it's not as noble as she claims. You should refuse, Eddie said flatly. Even if it's true, I wouldn't join any organization like that. He hurried on before anyone could ask why. If what she says is true, and that Alliance hoards genius minds and their work, that knowledge becomes power. Power money can buy. Put that much intellect together, and you have a force deeper than any old pure-blood fortune. Roger added with a shiver, If the managers have ambitions, they could change the world. Scott cut in before their guesses grew wilder. It's not that dramatic. I'll speak to Professor Dumbledore first. I want to hear what he says. Unexpectedly, a reply came the next morning. Professor Dumbledore had sent an invitation to afternoon tea in his flowing, looping handwriting. There's potions this afternoon, Roger said, glancing at the invitation. I'll go after potions. Scott put the card away and kept his appointment. After class, he went to the headmaster's office. Dumbledore had set out an array of pastries as usual. Come, sit, Scott. He smiled warmly. I can't wait. Delicious food makes people happy. Scott thanked him and took a seat. Dumbledore's smile softened. I thought you might come to speak, so I invited you first. Scott wasn't surprised. Even if Dumbledore hadn't been watching last night in real time, the castle's portraits would have filled him in. I wanted to talk about Miss Grapeland. Oh, eat up. Dumbledore gestured with his fork as he cut a small cake. He took a satisfied bite. You knew her identity already, didn't you? The Grey Lady came to see me, and it was you who asked her. Yes. Scott lowered his head, sipped his tea. Because the Grey Lady said you knew her true identity, I didn't press the matter then. Thank you for your trust, Scott. Dumbledore chuckled. You're always reliable, you know. Scott offered the compliment back. Dumbledore waved a hand and a plate of savory beef patties hopped into front of Scott. It seems Miss Grapeland has invited you, Dumbledore said. A magic society she called the Scholar Alliance? Scott nodded. Yes, her description sounded impressive, but what puzzled me was that none of the Hogwarts professors belonged to it. Dumbledore's expression grew reflective. The Scholar Alliance is indeed an ancient magical society. When I was a student, someone invited me. Scott paused, chewing a beef patty. He looked surprised. Dumbledore seemed to be remembering. I asked the wizard who invited me why, if the Alliance had gathered so much knowledge, they didn't use it as power for the greater good. He looked almost sorry for having invited me. Dumbledore smiled ruefully. He told me the Alliance exists to ensure the continuation of wizarding civilization. Unless that civilization is on the verge of destruction, they will not take part in struggles. Scott swallowed and asked, Do you think he was telling the truth? I believe he wasn't lying, Dumbledore said slowly, and I also believe those words reflected only his own views. Scott thought, no organization speaks with a single voice. Dumbledore went on, The Scholar Alliance closed its doors to me, but the man who invited me did not. He became my teacher and friend and helped me greatly. You should know his name, Nicholas Flamel. The most famous alchemist of modern times. Scott's eyes widened. I didn't expect him to be involved with the Alliance. His lifespan is longer than the Alliance's history. Could he be? He isn't the founder, Dumbledore cut in. Nicholas didn't care much for reviving ancient magic. So the knowledge bank? Scott asked. Was that Flamel's work? Dumbledore nodded and smiled. Nicholas said that, though it was a collaboration, the knowledge bank was something he was prouder of than the Philosopher's Stone. Scott's curiosity about the knowledge bank intensified, but Dumbledore shook his head about the Hogwarts professors. I don't know whether they were invited. Perhaps everyone refused. Scott wasn't entirely satisfied with that answer. It sounded unlikely that no one had even received an invitation. He leaned forward. I need your advice on this, Professor. 373, 273. The principal and the dean's advice. Dumbledore set down his knife and fork, picked up a silver teaspoon, and stirred the tea in his cup. My suggestion is, he lifted his teacup, took a sip, and then looked at Scott. Your decision must depend on your heart. Scott returned a puzzled look. Dumbledore put down his cup and smiled. I mean, you can join the Scholar Alliance. Under Scott's surprised gaze, he added, but remember, you should treat their knowledge bank only as a marketplace for information. Make necessary transactions in moderation, stay rational, and don't let the greed in your heart tempt you. He spoke with gravity. If you can do that, then joining the so-called Scholar Alliance won't harm you. Scott nodded and wanted to ask more. So the organization isn't entirely harmless, as Miss Grapeland hinted? The Scholar Alliance is led by 7 wizards who bear the title Great Scholar, and Nicholas Flamel was once one of them, Dumbledore said. Since Flamel's death, I haven't been able to learn much about them. Scott listened quietly. Dumbledore had more to say. I can tell you two things, he said. First, Flamel hinted that there are conceptual differences among the great scholars who lead the Alliance. Second, he once showed me some of the things that can be exchanged for academic credits within the Alliance. And after seeing them, I was actually glad I didn't join. Could you elaborate? Scott asked, unsatisfied with vagueness. Dumbledore obliged. Flamel originally joined the Alliance to exchange ideas on alchemy. As he lived longer and his reputation grew, he eventually earned the title of Great Scholar. More than a century ago, at the initiative of another great scholar, the seven of them created what they called their greatest masterpiece that combined ritual magic and alchemy, the Knowledge Bank. At first, the Knowledge Bank was a blessing to the Alliance. That great device promoted communication among members and tied together what had been a loosely affiliated group. More importantly, it helped preserve the wisdom of wizard civilization and made it easier for the Alliance to pursue its stated purpose of passing down our civilization's knowledge. Scott thought there had to be a but, and Dumbledore supplied it without delay. However, in the decades after the bank's creation, two ideological trends emerged among the Alliance's members. Some wizards believe they should remain obscure, pool their wisdom for dedicated research, and when new knowledge beneficial to wizardry arises, promote it subtly and quietly, nudging civilization forward without drawing attention. Others think that progress requires the best individuals to step forward and guide the masses. They believe the Alliance, with its concentrated wisdom and deep heritage, should stand up and lead the wizards openly. Where there are people, there is conflict, Scott thought. Even within a single organization, absolute unanimity is unlikely, especially in an ancient society like the Scholar Alliance. Dumbledore paused, ate a few bites of cream cake, drank more tea, then asked with interest, "Scott, which of these approaches do you think is more correct?" Scott considered and replied, "Both are right and wrong." Oh, Dumbledore's curiosity was visible. If their methods could be implemented as intended, Scott explained, both could promote the development of wizard civilization. Their disagreement is only about means, so in that sense, both are correct. Dumbledore nodded and then asked, "And why do you say they're also wrong?" Scott didn't hesitate. Because both assume they sit on a higher plane than everyone else. They look down on others with a condescending gaze and unilaterally decide how civilization should be advanced. That is pure arrogance. Dumbledore looked surprised. He had not expected Scott to put it so bluntly. Do you think even the first group is arrogant? Those who want to research quietly and promote progress subtly? Scott smiled. If their pooled research truly benefits civilization, wouldn't it be better to publish it openly and be acknowledged? That's an honor, not something to hide. The talk of obscurity and subtlety often feels like affected modesty. In past history, what contributions have they made to the development of wizard civilization? Without them, would our civilization have been unable to progress? Scott continued. Not at all, Dumbledore said gently. Ever since conceptual differences arose among the Alliance members, they've mostly been busy arguing and persuading one another. It's delayed other work. Scott was a little speechless. The Scholar Alliance sounded more disappointing than he had imagined. Dumbledore sighed. In the last decade or so, Flamel has not participated in the Alliance's internal affairs. He believed that once scholars' attitudes toward academia weren't pure, an organization founded in the name of scholars would become entirely corrupt. Scott understood. You don't think highly of this ancient society, even if they have the knowledge bank. No, Dumbledore admitted. Flamel wasn't worried that they could cause an irreparable catastrophe, because the wisdom stored in that device is controlled by the magic he helped construct, not by any single wizard. So Master Flamel wasn't worried that a great scholar could steal the knowledge from the bank. Dumbledore smiled. Indeed, Flamel considered his construction of the bank's core part, using alchemy, his proudest work. That device is impregnable. Then even the great scholars must obtain knowledge from the bank through proper channels by exchanging academic credits, Scott said. Dumbledore nodded. Even Flamel, who lived over 600 years, didn't have enough knowledge to exchange for everything in the bank. Scott nodded in full understanding. So I can join the Alliance. At the very least, the knowledge bank's exchanges are fair. Dumbledore warned him again. Remember, don't be blinded by greed. Scott solemnly agreed. Dumbledore then spoke of his own past. When I was young, I held different views. I even proposed creating an order dominated by wizards for the greatest good. Scott stayed quiet and listened. Dumbledore's voice grew deeper and rougher. After certain experiences, I came to recognize my own arrogance. I admitted one thing: this world doesn't need anyone to dominate it. So I made a new choice and took a different path. He recounted his youth briefly, but his tone carried a particular emotion and strength. Then he smiled. It's ironic, only after I fully awakened did Flamel show me some items that could be exchanged for credits in the Alliance. Some of them were astonishing. I'm glad I didn't join when Flamel first invited me. He did not shy away from his youthful mistakes. He felt fortunate his younger self hadn't done irreversible harm. A younger me might have been blinded by greed and, convinced of the greatest good, used the knowledge bank for irreversible things. Scott felt moved. Dumbledore was relieved his younger self hadn't joined, yet he didn't prevent Scott from joining now. It suggested he didn't trust his past self, but was willing to trust Scott, either because Scott was unlikely to be dangerous, or because Dumbledore understood how powerful youthful arrogance could be. Scott chose to take the more charitable view. They chatted lightly while enjoying their food. After watching the century-old Dumbledore eat 5 seemingly very sweet, very rich cream cakes without batting an eye, Scott took his leave. He thanked the headmaster and walked out through the side door of the headmaster's office on the 8th floor, crossed several corridors, and headed to Professor Flitwick's office. Perhaps because Scott had let out a hearty burp upon entering, Flitwick didn't greet him with the usual small pastries. Scott sat, clutching his still full stomach, and explained Miss Grapeland's invitation and his questions about the Scholar Alliance. Flitwick first expressed concern about Milton. "Is Mr. Greaves doing all right?" he asked, worried. He must always regret losing his musical talent. The always emotional Professor Flitwick seemed to empathize deeply with Milton. "I'll speak with him," he promised. He wasn't surprised by Grapeland's true identity. He apparently knew of it already. "The Scholar Alliance," he said, "once invited me, but I refused." "Why did you refuse?" Scott asked. "I don't approve of them," Flitwick said, frowning. He clearly had little regard for the Alliance. "I dislike their system of quantifying all knowledge and trading it like chips. I don't think academic research needs an institution. One can find better colleagues and like-minded wizards on one's own. But I don't object if you want to join," he added. "Everyone has the right to decide." He sipped his tea and then spoke of his youth with a nostalgic note. "When I was young, I had a fiery temper. If someone mocked me, I would often teach them a harsh lesson. The wizard who tried to recruit me was German and overly arrogant. I still remember his gaze and tone. He invited me as if it were the greatest honor of my life. I refused and taught him a lesson in the duel." Flitwick laughed, then lowered his voice. "I met other members of the Alliance later. I think some of them are a bit off." He looked at Scott. "Like Miss Grapeland, she thought of using Mr. Pettigrew's situation to threaten you. That was an extraordinarily poor invitation." Professor Flitwick shook his head in disapproval. "Wizards in the Scholar Alliance are often driven nearly mad by the academic credits on their cards." Scott, a little confused, listened as Flitwick explained. "In the Scholar Alliance, academic credits are everything. Their credits are like other wizards' deposits at Gringotts. The number causes them constant anxiety." Scott nodded. He understood. In his previous life, he had also worried about the number in his bank account and knew the feeling. Grapeland's method of recruitment had indeed been abnormal, bordering on mad. After half an hour with Professor Flitwick, Scott left and headed for the room of requirement. He planned to discuss the matter with the Ravenclaw mentor as well. Ravenclaw had been dead for 1,000 years. The fragment of her consciousness that had been left behind to watch over her daughter had slept for just as long. Her portrait, of course, had never heard of the Scholar Alliance, an organization founded more than 500 years ago. After Scott explained the situation, the Ravenclaw in the painting regarded him and said, "You can join them." She smiled faintly as she looked at Scott, who stood in front of the portrait with a somewhat surprised expression. "Because of the prophecy, because Medea is watching you, and because Salazar lurks behind the scenes, you must grow quickly, she went on. You don't have the luxury of weighing everything slowly, child. If something helps you get stronger, do not refuse it. Scott nodded. He really didn't have much room to be choosy now. Although he was technically safe until graduation, 2 years would pass quickly. He had to seize every opportunity to improve. I understand, he told the portrait. The Ravenclaw in the painting continued. You are interested only in magic itself. You do not want to be a leader. Power is more a burden than a goal for you. I am not worried that you will be seduced by their ideas. That's right, Scott said, smiling. In that moment, he decided to accept Miss Grapeland's invitation to join the Scholar Alliance. His goal, plainly, was to make use of the Alliance's knowledge bank to earn academic credits. How? Helena's study, beyond the inner room's door, held a trove of old magical knowledge that would be exchangeable for credits. Much of the material was obsolete for modern wizards, but the Scholar Alliance, whose original aim had been to revive ancient magic, would value it. Grapeland had also said that any knowledge not yet recorded in the knowledge bank would be accepted. Scott had no doubts about the richness of the collection Ravenclaw had assembled for Helena. That said, he couldn't act without consent. He needed the approval of both the Ravenclaw portrait and Helena herself. As he expected, the portrait agreed, and both Helena's painted and ghostly presences gave their permission. They all understood that the magical knowledge from a millennium ago had limited practical use today. For most wizards, those books were mainly useful for broadening one's understanding of magic, not for practical modern combat. Scott understood that clearly. He had tried learning some ancient charms. They were often more potent in raw power than modern equivalents, but they could not keep up with the speed and precision demanded by contemporary magical duels. The older spells were crude in their consumption of magic. Modern charms favored conciseness, speed, accuracy, and efficiency. Scott preferred that style, which was why he hadn't previously delved into the old ways. But the knowledge in Helena's study was worth trading as currency. That evening back in the dormitory, Scott's roommates pressed him for details about Dumbledore's and Flitwick's impressions of the Scholar Alliance. Scott summarized what he had learned. Eddie, surprised, said, "So they're not great, but they're not terrible either?" "Either way," Roger said, patting Eddie on the shoulder. "It's an organization that stood for over 500 years. Even Nicholas Flamel was a member in his time. We haven't even been invited." Eddie brightened when Scott mentioned the knowledge bank. If we had something like that, his eyes lit up. We could build the magical internet and become the media giants of the wizarding world. Roger agreed, and their conversation drifted into fantasy. Then Eddie lunged at Scott, grabbed his hand, and looked at him with hopeful intensity. "Scott, you have to exchange for the knowledge of the magical internet. Do you think that's possible?" Scott pulled his hand away with a small laugh. Wizards who possess such knowledge might not be willing to hand it over to the knowledge bank, and even if it's there, I wouldn't have enough academic credits to trade for it. Eddie sank back onto his bed, disappointed. "Are you really going to join them?" Milton asked, concern in his voice. Scott nodded. "I'm joining." Milton hesitated and finally said, "Be careful." "Don't worry," Scott reassured him. "I'm joining for the knowledge bank, not because of your problem. If that's the case, then fine." Milton smiled, but then paused. "Miss Grapeland is offering academic credits, and credits are incredibly precious. Why would she be willing to spend so much to win you over? There must be something else going on," he added, stepping closer and speaking seriously. "I think you should be more cautious, Scott." "Don't worry," Scott said. "Maybe the credits needed to fix yours and Caccini's problems won't be that many." Milton didn't look convinced and kept pressing, afraid his situation might drag Scott into danger. Scott didn't tell him the whole truth. He hadn't joined because of Milton's issue. The prophecy threatened him, and he needed to grow strong as fast as possible. Still, when Milton leapt up at Scott's next sentence, Scott laughed and repeated what Miss Grapeland had said. If he agreed to join the Scholar Alliance, she would provide the academic credits necessary to restore Milton's and Caccini's talents. Milton stood up at once. Roger clapped him on the shoulder. "So your musical talent will be back soon?" Roger asked. Oh, Eddie came over, grinning. That's great, Milton. I do hope your hypersensitivity doesn't come back, too. Milton waved a hand. No, that's not what I meant. He remained uneasy. He still worried over why Grapeland would pay such a price. Scott could only reassure him so much. He had made his decision the same day, but planned to tell Miss Grapeland formally during Care of Magical Creatures class the following week, as they had arranged. He didn't want to seem eager. Saturday morning found the Ravenclaw Quidditch team preparing for a match. Roger, the captain, and Eddie, the intelligence officer, were up early. Even at breakfast, they discussed tactics and traded barbs across the Great Hall at the Gryffindor team they would face. Then the owl delivery broke the mood. Terrorist attack. Ministry official assaulted. The Daily Prophet's bold headline fell like a stone into the hall and silenced the chatter. Students clustered over newspapers, eyes scanning frantic words. Exclamations broke out within minutes. The one attacked was the head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation, Barty Crouch. He was at the Quidditch World Cup Stadium the ministry built to inspect the construction. Luckily, Aurors stationed there rescued him in time. But the dark wizard who attacked Crouch escaped by apparition. The Aurors didn't catch him. Scott read the article with the others. There were no photos. No one had taken any at the scene. The attacker had been described as wearing black robes and a mask. Black robes and a mask could be Death Eaters, Eddie whispered. Scott put the paper down. He suspected the assailant might have been Barty Crouch's son, but suspicion without proof was just that. With the ministry so disordered, the chances of a prompt and effective investigation seemed small. He wondered about Voldemort. Under Medea's pressure, the Dark Lord should be trying to regain strength as quickly as possible. If he intended to resurrect himself, as in the original accounts, using the bone of a father, the flesh of a servant, and the blood of an enemy, he would need to be patient and wait for the right opportunity. Scott did not know whether Voldemort still had that patience. Perhaps he could not wait any longer. Then again, Harry was not his only enemy. 375. Confrontation with Grapeland. The attack on ministry official Barty Crouch felt like a trigger. In the days that followed, assaults began in quick succession. Members of the legal enforcement squad, Wizengamot officials, senior Aurors, even ordinary witches and wizards, none were spared. Seeing the list of victims, Scott's first thought was that Voldemort's Death Eaters were responsible. The attacked witches and wizards all shared one thing in common. They had helped bring down Voldemort and his followers in the previous wars. Scott wondered if Voldemort was trying to taste the blood of his enemies to decide whose blood best suited him. Given Voldemort's vanity, he would sneer at ordinary blood. What he really wanted was the blood of people like Harry, Dumbledore, or Medea. Unfortunately, none of those three were accessible to him. During the next Care of Magical Creatures class, Scott watched Grapeland speak beside Hagrid, eloquent and serious. She seemed to have entirely forgotten whatever agreement she had made with him. "Oh, Scott, I noticed you've been staring at Miss Grapeland," Fred teased. "If you're going to confess, we can help distract Hagrid," George added with a grin as they leaned in. "First, I'm just listening attentively, Fred," Scott said. "Secondly, don't talk about Professor Hagrid as if he were a wild beast, George." Near the end of the lesson, Scott found a moment to speak to Grapeland alone, while Roger kept the others occupied. "So what's your decision, Scott?" she asked in a low voice, her usual smile in place. Scott lowered his own voice. "Do your promises still stand, Miss Grapeland?" "You mean?" She arched an eyebrow. "You said that if I joined, you'd use academic credits to satisfy Milton and Caccini's requests." Her expression hardened. At last, she ground out, "Of course they stand." Scott's face lit up. "In that case, I'll join." "Good." Genuine pleasure softened her features. "Then we'll meet tonight at midnight in the Classical Music Club's common room." He nodded. They parted, and Fred and George, restrained by Roger, upped their teasing, but Scott ignored them. That night, he stopped by Professor Flitwick's office for dueling practice, rested in his dormitory, and then, before curfew, went with his roommates to the Classical Music Club's common room. Grapeland and Caccini were already there. Grapeland eagerly produced a golden card and thrust it toward him. "Take this. I'll teach you how to use it." "There's no rush." Scott smiled and nodded toward Milton and Caccini. Let's solve their problems first. Her smile deepened. You cunning boy. So you mean I have to fix their issues before you officially join the Scholar Alliance? Sorry, I can't help it, Scott said with a mock-shy smile. What if you change your mind and refuse to grant the credits after I join? Grapeland let out a little smoke ring from her pipe. Fair. What if I help them and you then back out on joining? Scott gave a sincere smile. You can trust me. I don't break my word. He glanced at his roommates. If you don't believe me, ask them. Eddie and Roger were quick to back him up. Scott always keeps his word, Eddie said. Never lies. The most trustworthy Ravenclaw. You've got my vote, Roger added, giving Milton an encouraging nudge. Milton stammered assent. Grapeland regarded them with a half smile, then angled her gaze at Scott. Coldly, do you expect me to just take their word for it? You can believe us, Eddie said. We're trustworthy. Right, Roger echoed. All right. She flicked a glance between the boys and then back at Scott. Show some sincerity, Scott. With a faint huff, she tilted her chin and took a slow puff from her pipe. You must understand one thing, she said. Ordinary people are not fit to join us. Her looks skimmed Scott's friends. Like your companions, she stepped closer. Remember, it's your honor to be admitted to the Scholar Alliance. Opportunities like this come once. If you don't value it, you'll never get another chance. Scott waved away the pipe smoke and took a quiet step back. Her smile grew slightly forced. It seems we can't fully trust one another, she said. Scott smiled faintly, reached into his pocket, and produced a roll of parchment. Then let's take proper measures, he said. She took the parchment, unrolled it, and frowned. A magic contract? Her expression showed surprise and a touch of respect. You came prepared. Scott met her gaze, having already shaded his mind with occlumency. I'm only a fifth year. Compared to you as an assistant, I'm the weaker side, he said. Grapeland scoffed, but handed the parchment back. Fine, I'll sign. Good. Scott let out an exaggerated sigh of relief. The parchment glowed faintly red and floated up from his hand. Let's sign this, then. They both extended their right hands and pressed them to the hovering parchment. A blinding red flash flared before settling. The parchment drifted back down. Scott pinched it between his fingers. 2 bright red handprints had scorched the page. He rolled the parchment and slid it back into his pocket, pleased. Grapeland proffered the golden card again. This time, Scott accepted it without hesitation. The card was metal, gold-colored but hard and cold to the touch. One side bore a scroll and quill. The other showed Prometheus tormented by an eagle sinking its beak into his heart. Scott paused at that image and understood the Scholar Alliance's symbolism, teachers or guardians in the mold of Prometheus. He checked the serial, 010723. Row 1, he asked. Row 1 denotes Britain, Grapeland said. You're the 723rd British member since the Knowledge Bank came into being. Input magic, she instructed. Scott channeled his magic into the card. It swelled and shifted, becoming a hardbound book with a golden cover. Hand it over. Grapeland tucked her pipe into her mouth, snatched the book, and opened it. She turned the pages to notes on joining the Scholar Alliance, membership rights and obligations, and showed them to him. If there's nothing problematic, sign here. Scott read carefully. Finding no unfair clauses, he signed the right-hand page. The book lifted from his hand, shrinking as a golden glow enveloped it, and reverted to a card. When the light faded, it fell toward him. He caught it. At the same moment, a subtle sensation brushed him, like a vast, invisible presence had fixed him with a conscious, weighty gaze. The feeling was unnerving and oddly intimate. That's it, Grapeland said, already bored, as if she could not be bothered to explain more. You can explore the rest on your own. He transformed the card into a book again by pouring in more magic. It changed back when he stopped. Holding the card, Scott kept his eyes on Grapeland. Now it's your turn to keep your promise, he said. You said you'd handle Milton and Caccini's credits. Aren't you going to do it? Grapeland looked at the card in his hand and smiled. While I'm here, I can answer any questions you have, she said lightly. If there's something you don't understand, no need. Scott smiled back and produced the signed parchment, shaking it slightly. Hurry up and keep your word, Miss Grapeland. Now that we've both signed, I assume you won't back out. She bristled and, with a look of effort, drew another golden card from her pocket. Grapeland's card turned into a hardcover book the moment she took it out. She slipped the pipe back into her mouth, held the open book with her right hand, and reached toward Caccini with her left. Caccini, clearly excited, produced a similar golden card and pushed it toward her. Grapeland casually set Caccini's card onto the inner page of the book, raised the pipe, and blew out a plume of white smoke. Strictly speaking, Caccini isn't the owner of this card, she told Scott. Although she inherited 5% of what's left on it, she still needs my help to use it. As she spoke, Caccini's card expanded into a matching hardcover book with the same gilded cover. Grapeland tucked her own book under her arm, opened Caccini's, tapped the inner pages several times, and handed it back. Now it's my turn to spend. She glanced at Scott and Milton, then opened her own book again, a pained expression returning to her face. With the power of the greatest magical device, the knowledge bank, and with the voluntary consent of both parties, retrieve what was exchanged under the Hermes Oath. Grapeland pressed hard on the page and spoke through gritted teeth to Scott. A total of 1,000 credits. Remember, kid, I had to pay 500 credits on your friend's behalf. Scott watched her expression without betraying much. So the oath Medea used was the Hermes Oath? He said, sounding like he'd just learned something. Grapeland shot him a sharp look. I won't answer your questions. Go spend credits and find the answers yourself. She stepped in front of him. The amiable smile was gone. Listen, credits are hard to earn, she leaned in and whispered in Scott's ear. I fought a centaur at great risk to get some obscure knowledge about them, and it only converted into 500 credits. Her tone made it sound as if she wanted to bite his ear off. Scott's eyes flicked. The strange incident he, Eddie, and the Weasley twins had run into in the Forbidden Forest finally made sense. This was the person involved. To obtain knowledge not recorded in the knowledge bank, she had impersonated a dark wizard to attack a centaur, cold-blooded and ruthless. Scott remembered the encounter clearly and concluded Grapeland's actions had been deliberate, a scheme to exploit the centaur. 500 credits had been worth a big risk. Still, the fact she'd managed to exploit something as studied as a centaur showed skill. Remember, you owe me a favor, Grapeland said fiercely, then turned and walked away without waiting for a reply. She acted as if she feared nothing, unconcerned that Scott might expose her as the dark wizard from the Forbidden Forest. She didn't know that everything she'd just said had been recorded. Scott had pinned his eagle-shaped sound recording brooch inside the lining of his robe that night, but he wouldn't betray her now. Unspent leverage was more valuable. While Scott's thoughts raced, Grapeland approached Milton, blowing rings of sage-scented smoke. Tell me your full name, lucky kid, she demanded. Milton coughed and stepped back, covering his nose. Between coughs, he managed, Milton Weaver Greaves. Grapeland coughed once, too, then spoke clearly. I, Stephanie Grapeland, temporarily authorize Milton Weaver Greaves to use the Book of Prometheus. She shoved the heavy book into Milton's hands. Come here, she said, grabbed his collar, and dragged him to stand before Caccini. Hold the book properly and face Caccini. Milton glanced back. Scott gave him an encouraging look. Grapeland smacked Milton lightly on the head. I said stand properly. Milton straightened and faced Caccini obediently. Grapeland tapped both books with her hands, then stepped back. The pages began to flip on their own, faster and faster, as dense, obscure symbols leaped from each book and merged into an illusory scale suspended between them. Wind swirled, Milton's long hair whipped upward. The scale glowed brighter, weights forming on each end. The balance swayed, settled, spun 180 degrees, and reversed. It's done. Grapeland stepped forward as the illusion dissolved into motes of light and the book stilled. How do you feel, Caccini? She asked. Caccini, who had been standing with her eyes closed, opened them and smiled. I feel whole, like I've finally come back to myself. Thank you, cousin. Scott raised an eyebrow at the familial term. Grapeland smiled back. As long as you're satisfied, and try not to be foolish again. Caccini nodded earnestly. Scott, Eddie, and Roger moved to Milton's side. Eddie asked, impatient, How are you? Have you changed back, Milton? Milton bowed his head, hair falling over his face. I'm fine, he said, voice shaking. It's just, I didn't mean to cry. I don't know why. I just couldn't help it. The three boys exchanged looks. I didn't expect, indeed, The crying Milton is back. After their silent glance, they began to comfort him. This is good, Scott said. Congratulations, Milton. You finally got what you wanted. Roger added, That's great. Our familiar Milton is back. Eddie laughed. Artists are emotional, you know. I only heard that saying before, but now I can see exactly what it means. They all smiled. Scott felt a strange familiarity. Before Milton's change, they had spent years with the boy Scott called the British Lindayu. Unmotivated sobbing had been common. Grapeland snatched the book from Milton's hands. This kid, his tears are dripping on my book. Give it back. Milton wiped his face and mumbled, I'm sorry, tears still falling. Caccini suddenly laughed. This is the Milton I know. Milton flushed crimson and flustered, embarrassed to still be crying. I didn't mean to be like this. At that moment, Scott cut off his laughter. Someone's coming. Everyone fell silent. Scott's magical senses were well known at Hogwarts, and even Caccini and Grapeland had heard of them. Grapeland quickly drew her wand and waved. The candles in the common room snuffed out. Hide, she whispered, pulling Caccini behind a curtain. Eddie and Roger dragged Milton behind the large piano. Scott, Eddie hissed. But Scott had already identified the newcomers. No need to hide, he said, smiling. It's Fred and George. A soft knock sounded at the door. Scott, open the door quickly. We know you're in there, a lowered voice called. If you don't open up soon, we'll use Alahomora. Scott sighed. I'll open it. If this drags on, they'll bring Snape over, and that will be a mess. Shush! Shush, shush! Eddie hissed, terrified Scott's words would jinx them. Scott moved to the door and unlocked it from the inside. Fred and George shoved it open and squeezed in, grinning. Hey, Scott, your dorm's nightlife is thriving. But you didn't include us. That's not very friendly. They clapped their hands on Scott's shoulders in unison. Eddie nervously hurried over to close the door. Fred and George laughed. Don't worry, we checked. The old bat's already asleep in bed. Eddie leapt up and attempted to clamp their mouths. Scott laughed. Don't worry, Fred put a charm up when they came in. Only the 6 of us can hear what's said. Fred and George beamed, prouder than ever. They leaned closer. I have to say, we noticed something yesterday afternoon in Care of Magical Creatures. You're a bit off, friend, George teased. Roger was covering for you then, but honestly, it was too obvious. You couldn't fool seasoned us. Quick, tell us, did you have a late-night date with the lovely Miss Grapeland here? Scott smirked. A date with 6 people? That's normal, Fred said. Eddie and Roger are keeping watch. Milton and Caccini provide the music. What a romantic night, the twins chimed. The candles flared back to life as Grapeland pulled Caccini toward the door. Oh, beautiful Miss Grapeland. Fred and George bowed extravagantly. And the handsome Miss Strozzi, Fred added, and both winked. Good evening, the twins called, still bowed. Grapeland returned the bow with a warm smile. Her manner toward them was suddenly very friendly. Even Caccini, whose personality had shifted, smiled genuinely. Fred asked bluntly, Are you on a date with Scott, Miss Grapeland? Oh, what makes you think that? Grapeland laughed. Fred raised an eyebrow and decided not to press. I wouldn't fancy that cunning kid, she teased, glancing at Scott. She stepped closer to Fred, patted his cheek playfully, and in a deliberately husky voice added, If you asked me out, I might consider it. She let her gaze skim both brothers' Engelbrecht faces a couple of times. If you two asked me out together, honestly, I wouldn't know who to choose. She pursed her full red lips, chuckled, nudged Fred's chest, and strode past him with long-legged confidence, slipping out the door. Caccini made a face at the twins and followed her. Fred and George, used to joking, were momentarily stunned by the teasing of an older woman. Their ears had gone a faint shade of red. Scott couldn't help letting out a laugh. Eddie, Roger, and Milton, who had been following the 2 women outside, saw the twins' reactions and suppressed chuckles that carried clearly in the quiet corridor. As expected of Fred, still not daring to confess to Angelina, Scott said with a smile. And as expected of George, Fred's brother. You two are so pure. This was an unusual sight. Fred and George, Hogwarts' notorious pranksters, had been completely rattled. Surrounded by Scott and his roommates' jeers, they couldn't mount any effective counterattack and fled in disarray. After the 2 Weasleys were gone, Scott and his friends were far from satisfied. This prank, Eddie laughed until he could barely breathe. I could laugh about this for a year. No, Roger snorted. I'll laugh until graduation." Even Milton was smiling broadly. Scott sighed. "From now on, we can call them the innocent Weasley brothers." Another round of suppressed laughter followed. They hurried back to their dormitory, set up a sound-dampening charm on the room, and then let themselves laugh until their sides ached. "What a pity," Eddie said, sprawled on his bed and rubbing his stomach. "If only I'd thought to use the panoramic telescope to record that." "I'm sure a lot of students would pay for a copy," Scott added. "It's so rare to see those two stumped," Eddie said gleefully. "I think I've found their weakness." After a while, Roger reminded them it was late and they had classes in the morning. "We should sleep." But Eddie suddenly shot up from his bed and hurried to the sofa by the window where Scott was sitting. "I can't sleep either. I'm impatient to look closer. Oh, at the Book of Prometheus." "Me neither," Milton said. "I'm oddly excited. I feel like I have new inspiration." He covered his mouth and, choking back tears, added, "Oh no, I didn't mean to cry." "It's fine. Cry if you want to," the others said in unison. Milton, wiping his eyes, began sketching a musical staff. In Eddie's eager gaze, Scott took the golden card from his pocket, keyed in his magic, and transformed it into the Book of Prometheus. The book's golden metal cover bore a relief of Prometheus, more elaborate than the little emblem on the card. The same figure surrounded by several concentric circles of intricate patterns. Scott opened it. On the first page, in small script, was a single line, exploring the origin of wizard, perhaps self-destruction. Eddie, leaning over to read, spoke the sentence aloud. Scott paused. The line reminded him of the warning the Ravenclaw mentor had given him in his first class. What did it mean? He reached out and touched the inner page. The material wasn't ordinary parchment or any wizarding material he knew. He turned the page. A personal file filled the sheet. For now, it showed only his name and card number. The rest was blank. Then another small line appeared at the top of the page. "Hello, respected Scott Trollope. Welcome to the Scholar Alliance. Please complete your personal information as soon as possible. Note, you can write directly on the page in any form, and the book will automatically record what you write." Scott raised an eyebrow, took the pen from his pocket, and began to write. He filled in his basic information. As he finished, his handwriting faded, and the text reappeared as printed script. "Congratulations, your personal file has been synchronized and recorded in the knowledge bank." A new line appeared at the top. Scott turned the page. At the very top were several large options. Submit. Exchange. Your credits, 0. What you have submitted. What you have exchanged. Scott tapped Submit out of curiosity. The content beneath it vanished and a prompt appeared. Please write the knowledge you want to submit directly on the page. A small cancel appeared in the corner. Scott felt a pang of déjà vu, like using a Muggle tablet. The Book of Prometheus looked like a magical tablet of sorts, simpler than a tablet in some ways, but offering things a tablet never could. It drew on the knowledge bank to do things that altered people, like how Milton had suddenly been able to pull inspiration back for a song. Impatient, Scott hit and chose Exchange. The menu dropped down into 3 main categories: knowledge, items, mutual aid. Scott opened mutual aid briefly, like a bulletin board for Scholar Alliance members, summoning research partners, acquiring materials, hiring muscle, looking for teachers. Anything could be posted for a credit reward. Eddie and Roger peered over his shoulder, enthused. "Look for a magic internet," Eddie urged. Scott switched to knowledge. The entries were organized like Hogwarts subjects: charms, transfiguration, dark arts, potions, alchemy, ancient runes. Eddie asked uncertainly, where would a magic internet be? Alchemy. Scott clicked alchemy. The page blanked and the prompt reappeared. Please write the key information of the knowledge you require on the page. Scott wrote the keyword knowledge bank. The words flashed, then vanished, and new text filled the page. Eddie and Roger shouted together, "It's here!" Book, Knowledge Bank Core, Alchemy Section, Construction Record. Author, Nicholas Flamel. Exchange requires 1 credit. They all gaped. Only 1 credit? So cheap. It must be a bug. Exchange it. Scott's trembling finger tapped Confirm Exchange. A pop-up snapped up. You don't have enough credits. He had 0. Eddie and Roger urged him on. For a moment, Scott simply watched them. No rush, he said quietly. Why no rush? They demanded. You idiots, don't be so hasty. That price being 1 credit probably isn't a bug, Scott said. They calmed. You mean that's the real price? Eddie asked. Scott nodded. Think about a potion like Felix Felicis. Almost everyone knows the recipe, but very few can brew it properly. Potion masters can. That's why it's expensive. Knowledge can be the same. Learning a thing and being able to actually use it are different. That makes sense, Roger admitted. Even if we spent a credit on it, we might not understand or be able to apply it. Especially since none of us have studied alchemy, Eddie added, and Scott only knows a little. Scott shrugged. Let's see typical prices. He tapped into Transfiguration and typed animagus. A long menu unfurled. Eddie and Roger began to chant the price ranges at him. Animagus Overview requires 500 credits. Detailed Steps, Hand-Holding Animagus Guide, 1,000 credits. Advanced Human Transfiguration Techniques, 3,000 credits. Druidic Multiform Transfiguration Research, 5,000 credits. The entries ranged from a few dozen credits to thousands. The depth and breadth of information under a single heading like animagus was staggering. Scott remembered Dumbledore and Flitwick's warnings. A single subject could hold oceans of knowledge. Just the animagus section alone was enough to make him want to spend everything he had. He hadn't even looked at the items menu yet. It's dangerous to keep looking, Scott said, closing the book and turning it back into a card. You can get greedy. Roger yawned as he padded back to his bed. Yeah, not being able to afford things is the biggest obstacle to progress. Eddie stretched and sighed. And the worst part is knowing what you want, but not having the credits. Across the room, Milton's voice rang out, bright and delighted. My new song is called Prometheus's Regenerated Liver. 378. Caution, peace of mind, nightmare before sleep took him. Scott lay in bed, turning the golden card over between his fingers, a growing sense of absurdity in his chest. A system really existed after transmigration. Web novels hadn't lied. He studied the card. It wasn't some flashy, protagonist-only miracle. It was the same type of system every member of the Scholar Alliance had. There was nothing spectacular to exchange for it. It felt ordinary. That thought made him smile inwardly and then frown. No matter how hard he tried to keep his feet on the ground, the lazy fantasy of signing in, drawing cards, and becoming unstoppable like the heroes in the novels kept sneaking in. Scott pushed it away. He was a transmigrated soul, not the main character, and he had no golden finger to shortcut effort. In the real world, he could rely only on his talent and relentless study. Things like the Book of Prometheus and the Knowledge Bank, useful and intriguing as they were tools, not replacements for work. The book might look like a system, but at its core, it was just a magical device wizards had constructed a century ago. A tool could ease the way, it could not do the work for him. He warned himself not to fall into dependence, greed, or laziness, and finally drifted off. Because he'd stayed up late, Scott and his roommates shuffled into the great hall, yawning at breakfast, eyes heavy, but manners intact. They didn't miss the chance to flash a teasing smile at Fred and George Weasley across the hall. Good morning, they called. After sitting, Scott greeted Dylan and Kayla, the couple across from them. Morning. You all look worse than I feel. Didn't sleep? We stayed up too late, Scott admitted, fishing out a packet of instant coffee and making a cup. Kayla grinned at him. Look at those first years staring. Being a prefect suits you. Everyone thinks you're impressive. Scott handed instant coffee packets to his roommates and glanced down the table. A few younger students who had been gawkingly looked away. I'm not that impressive, he said, taking a sip. You've been a prefect for almost a year, Kayla sighed. But you never really enforced house discipline or looked after the younger ones. Scott considered it. Aside from patrolling the compartments on the return train, he couldn't think of anything he'd done as a prefect that had actually helped the house. Fair enough. I'm an incompetent prefect, he admitted. Glad you agree, Kayla said, displeased but amused. Then she added more seriously, this Saturday evening there's a reading event in the Common Room's library. You have to come. A reading event? Scott had never heard Ravenclaw held anything like that. Penelope, the seventh-year female prefect, appeared at their table and sat down. I organized it, she said. It's to help everyone review before exams. Eddie snorted. Exams? It's only early April. Exam week isn't until June. Penelope smiled. You'd be surprised how quickly time passes. It'll be once a week leading up to exams, and we want you to attend the first one. Lots of Ravenclaw students want to meet you, especially the first years. They've heard about you and admire you. Scott blinked. You're in 7th year and prepping for NEUTs, and we're in 5th for OOLs. Won't this take up your time? I'm confident about my exams, Penelope said lightly. Besides, I'm graduating soon. Consider this one of my last meaningful contributions to the house. She stood, tossed her hair, and added with a wink, I don't have your knack for making house promotional videos, so this is my small way of helping. After a day of classes, Scott headed to the room of requirement after dinner with the Book of Prometheus to show it to Helena, the Ravenclaw mentor in the portrait. The portrait was fascinated, especially with the alchemy section. An interesting design, she said, truly fitting for an alchemy master, worthy of someone like Nicholas Flamel. Scott had a plan. He'd spent some credits to unlock an obscure piece of ancient magic from the outer study and had also exchanged a small amount to access Nicholas Flamel's Knowledge Bank core, alchemy construction record. The record only filled a dozen pages when expanded and was full of material that, as Scott had expected, was beyond his practical grasp. Even what he could understand, he couldn't begin to replicate, the work of a master at the pinnacle of alchemy. So he copied the content onto parchment verbatim, floated the parchments before Helena's portrait, and left the portrait to interpret the remainder. That was his advantage. If the mentor understood it, she could teach him what he needed. The mechanics of exchanging knowledge for credits, however, were more tedious than he'd imagined. The Knowledge Bank insisted that anything exchanged for credits had to be handwritten into the Book of Prometheus, stroke by stroke, as a sign of respect for knowledge. Scott tried to use tools to speed it up and was warned by the system, so he sat and wrote. By curfew, after 4 hours of copying, he had earned over 1,300 points. Helena watched him and could not hide her concern. Their rules are so strict, she said. Do you really want to waste this much study time? Scott knew she was right. He'd used his credits to get animagus-related knowledge that would actually help him now, and the credits had nearly vanished. The whole process was time-consuming, and, though profitable in credits, not worth doing indiscriminately. He decided to be more selective in future exchanges, to use the knowledge bank only where it would accelerate his real goals rather than distract him. With that resolve, the novelty of the book faded into something more ordinary, a useful tool to be used with care. Leaving the room of requirement, Scott ran into Harry Potter in the corridor leading to the stairs. Harry looked haggard, paler than before. Scott felt a flash of alarm. Evening, Harry. You don't look well. Evening, Scott, Harry said weakly. I haven't been sleeping. I keep dreaming. Dreaming of Voldemort? Scott asked. He'd heard the Ravenclaw team had won the recent Quidditch match and that Harry had struggled. He hadn't realized how badly the outside events were affecting him. Harry leaned against the cold stone and rubbed his forehead. All sorts of things. Even when he's not at full power, he's planned so many attacks. Some reported, some not. I told Dumbledore, and he said to learn occlumency. He wanted Snape to teach me, but I refused. Learning occlumency is sensible, Scott agreed. You need to stop him from getting into your head. Harry's expression hardened. It's a good idea in theory, but Snape teaching me? He hates me. I don't want him poking around in my mind. Scott knew Snape's manner would make learning occlumency difficult for Harry. Clearing and calming the mind required a teacher the student could at least stand to be around. If you keep having these dreams, it could go further, Scott warned. There's a risk that the connection could let him read memories, not just send images. Harry made a face of disgust. I want Lupin to teach me, but he says he's not skilled at occlumency either. I was thinking maybe my godfather could teach me over the summer. Do you know occlumency? Scott looked at him. I taught myself from library books. I know the basics, but I'm not an expert. I was wondering if, Harry began, then stopped, embarrassed to ask outright. Scott offered, I can lend you my notebook. It has book excerpts and some of my notes. I don't have much practical experience, but it might help. Thanks, Harry said, relieved though still disappointed. I know you probably can't teach me a lot in person. Scott patted his shoulder. I'll leave the notebook in the dormitory, give it to you at breakfast tomorrow. He meant it. Part of the reason he couldn't teach Harry himself was time. The other part was honesty. With his level, there wasn't much more he could add beyond what was in the notebook. Goodbye, Harry said softly. Goodbye, Scott replied, then went down the stairs with the weight of other people's fears added to his own list of things to fix. 379. News about Carlo and Roll. Scott felt a storm coming. Medea's sudden appearance had thrown the original story he knew completely off course. The magical world was in chaos, and now Lord Voldemort had clearly made a move. Scott couldn't predict how things would unfold. Over the next few days, the attacks continued. The Ministry of Magic tried, but the Aurors still couldn't catch the perpetrators. Harry's occlumency improved only slowly, despite Scott lending him his notebook. His condition was visibly getting worse. Worrying about Harry, Sirius Black returned to Hogwarts on Thursday and began assisting Professor Lupin. His presence seemed to help Harry, but Snape's mood darkened noticeably. Lambeau, whom Scott hadn't seen for a while, flew into the castle after dinner on Thursday and sought Scott out. Scott led him to an empty classroom and set protective charms around them before they spoke. Lambeau waited until the wards were in place, then crowed excitedly. "Congratulations," he said. "That gift you sent last Christmas finally paid off." "Gift?" Scott thought a moment, then remembered. "You mean the one I gave to Caro?" He'd nearly forgotten it, but now his interest sharpened. "Did Caro finally make a move on his cousin Roll?" "Yes," Lambeau said. "He should have." "Tell me everything," Scott urged. "I didn't see it myself," Lambeau admitted. "I heard about it when I was near the Ministry. Word is there was a clash in Diagon Alley, lots of onlookers." He flapped his wings. "It involved Caitlin Roll and Elijah Caro's father." Scott's eyes widened. "How?" "I thought the crow you sent to Durmstrang would have reported back to you." "Durmstrang's too far," Lambeau said. "After a crow flies that far, who knows if you can still rely on it?" Scott shrugged and pressed on. He was curious why two pure-blood families, who cared fiercely about their reputations, would make a public scene. "Tell me about the Diagon Alley clash." "They ran into each other by chance, they say," Lambeau replied. "But they started arguing, and it turned physical." Scott guessed aloud, "If your gift took effect, then people must have known what they were arguing about." Lambeau flapped again, practically spilling the story. "Mr. Roll demanded that Mr. Caro hand over that damned murderous son, and Mr. Caro shot back that your daughter is responsible for this too. Mr. Roll shouted, 'You know what my daughter suffered,' and struck Mr. Caro in the face. They wrestled, and at one point drew wands, but the crowd separated them before anything worse happened." Scott grinned. "So something really did happen between Elijah Caro and Caitlin Roll. The boy's even been called a murderer by his prospective father-in-law." "That's right," Lambeau confirmed. Scott sighed with mock regret. "It's a shame I couldn't see it with my own eyes. I directed the whole play and missed the final act." He stroked Lambeau's feathers. "Thanks for bringing the news. It's a relief to know my enemies are in trouble." Lambeau preened and cawed proudly. "Bring me more details if you hear them." "No problem," Lambeau promised. Scott was about to open the window to let him go when Lambeau added with pride, "I also heard the official name of Medea's organization, the whole Wizarding Council. I managed to get a partial list of its members, especially those currently serving in the Ministry." "Good," Scott said, smiling. "You're my best helper, Lambeau." He took out his portable notebook and wrote furiously as Lambeau recited names. When he finally looked at the page, he felt a headache coming. "This is only part of it?" "Just part," Lambeau said. Even a partial list was staggering. Members from the Minister of Magic down to obscure clerks, spread evenly across departments. Scott let out a low whistle. "Medea's almost ready. She could change the whole regime at any moment." Lambeau added, "About the Death Eater attacks on Ministry officials and some civilians, the Ministry's pro-Voldemort faction is doing nothing, while the other two factions are searching hard but making no progress." Scott nodded. "That's expected. If Voldemort dared to do this, he must be confident they can't trace him. I'm looking forward to a direct confrontation between Medea and the Dark Lord." Lambeau left in high spirits, eager to fly into the crowds and see what else he could find. Scott warned him again on the way out. "Be careful. Medea knows you exist. She's tried to harm you before." "Don't worry," Lambo said, and darted off. The news about the Caro and Roll families was a welcome distraction for Scott, but nothing more, until Friday night when he saw Elijah Caro himself inside Hogwarts. The boy, with that smug, wicked expression Scott had come to recognize, had managed to sneak into the castle under an ordinary invisibility cloak and was lurking under Ravenclaw Tower, apparently planning to ambush Scott. He didn't realize how naive that was. An ordinary invisibility cloak couldn't mask the magical fluctuations around him. In Scott's perception, Elijah's presence blazed out as clearly as a candle in the dark. 380. Completely crazy Carlo. It was nearly curfew on Friday night when Scott left Professor Flitwick's office. The castle was empty and silent. Before he reached Ravenclaw Tower, he felt a disturbance of magic coming from behind the thick stone wall to the right of the tower. It had been some time since he last sensed Elijah Caro's magic, and although the quality of that magic had shifted since then, Scott recognized it at once. He had made a point of remembering his enemy's signatures. Elijah had left a deep mark on him. He had not expected to run into Caro here. Scott had just finished dueling training with Flitwick and was exhausted, his stamina and magic nearly drained. He was in a poor state. That made him stop immediately when he picked up Caro's presence and slipped behind a nearby pillar in the corridor. Fatigue had narrowed his magical senses. He could only pinpoint Caro to roughly 200 meters away. He wasn't sure whether Caro, hiding beyond the wall, had seen him approach. Then Scott felt the other magic move. Caro had seen him and was shifting in his direction. On paper, Scott was at a disadvantage. He did not panic. He'd fought Caro before and knew his level. The current magic signature suggested the man had not made any leaps forward. Even drained as he was, Scott trusted he could handle a wizard like Caro without overexerting himself. He drew 2 potions from his shifting lizard skin bag, uncapped them, and swallowed them in quick succession. Vitality poured back into him. He stowed the bottles and eased out his wand. The tip traced a silent arc. A thick white smoke from the wand and coiled around his feet, spreading fast. Night deepened. The smoke grew denser until it blurred everything. When the haze reached the stone wall where Caro crouched, the other man's magic stilled and then began to retreat. Scott smiled and started to step forward. The smoke kept expanding and Caro couldn't slip out of it. Scott moved soundlessly, closing the distance until he could hear labored breaths. Caro was about to speak when Scott acted. Stupefy. The red jet of light punched through the smoke and struck Caro squarely in the head. Scott heard him collapse. The result surprised Scott. He had expected Caro to have some hidden trinket or ward prepared. Who had given him the nerve to trespass into Hogwarts like this? Gryffindor? Or had Caro simply lost his mind? To be safe, Scott fired a rope from his wand that bound the fallen form to the flagstones. He then used a gust to disperse some of the smoke. Only then did he notice Caro's invisibility cloak. The rope wrapped around an empty, invisible outline. Scott frowned and moved closer to the spot, thinking fast. He wanted to kill the man outright, but this was Hogwarts. He couldn't risk being seen afterward. "Trouble," he muttered, and began pulling wooden blocks from his bag. With a flick of his wand, he turned them into mice. A swarm of rodents scurried over Caro's shape, burrowing at seams and pockets. 2 of them dragged Caro's wand over and set it at Scott's feet. The others scattered. It seemed Caro had nothing else on him. Scott breathed a little easier. He stepped to where the invisible form lay and gave it a kick. There was a clear, metallic clink on the stones, small, distinct in the night. Before Scott could react, a razor-thin red beam struck his chest. Pain exploded through him. His body flew back, and he landed hard on the flagstones. He coughed, hand clamped to his chest, and forced himself upright. Caro lay there, still apparently unconscious, but a small figure had appeared beside him, a house elf. "Woo!" the creature whimpered and began to work a spell to rouse Caro. "Wake up, my little master!" A white light flashed from its finger and enveloped the invisible shape. "Ugh!" Caro grunted as consciousness returned, and he sat up, hoarse. "Well done, Tata! Quickly, get this blasted rope off me!" "Tata will, now!" the house elf said in a soft, anxious voice. "Please be quiet, little master. This is Hogwarts. It would be terrible if someone found us." "So move faster." Caro snapped. Tada pointed and used a precise bit of magic to slice the rope binding him. Caro pulled back the hood of his invisibility cloak and glared at Scott, who was propped up on one elbow. "Heh heh, long time no see, Scott Trollope." He laughed in a low, crazed whisper that sounded half triumphant, half unhinged. One hand reached from beneath the cloak and scooped a shiny metal button from the stones. His head, no, an illusion of his head, seemed to float and pick up his wand. He laughed again, forcing the button into his mouth. "I kept it in my mouth." Scott pushed himself up and stood, bracing one hand on the flagstones. He kept his face calm. "Using yourself as bait to spring a magic item from your mouth," he said evenly. "Well played, Caro." Caro's eyes widened in surprise and then rage. He stumbled back a few steps and leveled his wand. How are you okay?" "You did well," Scott said. "You almost had me." He smiled and with his free hand drew a golden card from an inner pocket of his robe, the Scholar Alliance identity card, and held it between his fingers like a talisman. He was still tired. The potions had helped, but fatigue washed over him in waves. He kept his voice light. "I didn't expect this thing to block your sudden attack, but it did." Caro went deadly still. Even Tada's eyes widened at the card. "Take me away, Tada," he barked. "Now!" "No, little master. There are mice. So many mice," Tada cried, panicking as the rodents swarmed her. Caro pulled his hood back on and tried to vanish. His form slid from Scott's view, though his magic signature remained plain to Scott's senses. "No need to rush, Caro," Scott said, smiling faintly. "You don't come back to Hogwarts very often. You can take your time. Protego." A shield charm erupted around Scott just as a violent red crack, Reducto, shot toward him from Caro. The blasting curse hammered into his shield and blistered but didn't break it. Caro shouted, "Petrificus totalis," and Scott, acting on instinct, flicked his wand and pinned Tada with the full body bind, stopping the house elf from freeing her master. The mice swarmed her in a frenzy, making her attempts feeble. "Die!" Caro roared, and Scott felt a cold, violent intention. He recognized the magic before it arrived. "Crucio!" He dove aside, heavy-footed from fatigue, narrowly avoiding the unforgivable curse. Another red beam tore toward him at once. "Damn it! You should be out of energy!" Caro shrieked as he bit on the button-shaped device again. From the tip of his wand, a crow materialized in a flash and intercepted the beam with a horrible, startled squawk. The crow hit the blast and turned to ash in a flurry of black feathers. "Crucio!" Caro launched it again. Scott wanted to scream for breath, but forced himself calm, drawing air through his nose to steady himself. Before he could move, a silver-white phoenix descended silently from above and passed between him and the spell. The Crucio struck the phoenix. The energy shattered against the flagstones, cracking one slab. The phoenix's semi-ethereal plumage rippled, then smoothed out as its form steadied. "Apologies, Scott," came Dumbledore's voice from the bird's beak. "It is my dereliction of duty that allowed someone to sneak into Hogwarts."